feel like we always have this dead air.
Here we go.
So
No more dead air. We've started.
Have the normal talk.
We've started right now. At least I think we've started. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the BTR live stream. Today, we're going to be talking about the spiritual and esoteric nature of what's going on today with all this chaos that's around us. We have a very nice purple color behind us. And with us is Geo and Saturnalia and Jules. And we are going to be joined by a couple of more people later on, including the world-famous Sunny. Sunny is coming soon. Don't go anywhere. And don't forget to subscribe right now. So let's start with Saturnalia. I know you're not going to be able to be here for a long time, but I wanted to get your take on what you've been seeing right now in the news with all this rioting and all of this change in the air and the people kneeling down. From a spiritual perspective, where do you place this and where do you think we're headed?
Well, I mean, I think you put it pretty well by saying that there's change in the air. I mean, I think that I don't know, this is going to sound kind of loony, but I feel like there's almost like a spiritual elevation that I mean, it's not me saying this. I've seen a lot of magical people, occultists and the like, saying this online, that they feel like there's a sort of strange spirit in the air. As per the exact circumstances of this, I'm not really sure. I've seen a lot of people talking about the astrology of the dates surrounding these protests and riots. And a big thing that people were talking about is the strawberry moon, the full moon tomorrow. The moon has been waxing the entire time of these protests. I don't know. And yesterday, the sun squared Mars. I'm looking at an astrological chart right now, and I'm not a pro-astrologer, but it seems like there's some interesting stuff going on with that.
What exactly do you mean by the moon? You said the moon's doing what?
Tomorrow is a full moon. It's the strawberry moon, which is a form of particularly large full moon. So, I mean, this sort of fits into a lot of myths. I mean, you know, the origin of the term lunacy being this madness brought about by the heightened moon.
And Geo, what say you about what's going on right now?
Well, it's hard to keep up. It's hard to just like endlessly scroll through Twitter and seeing the latest psyop going on. I think, you know, me and a lot of people online have come to a similar conclusion. Meta Nomad has a good tweet. I tweeted about this. But basically, there seems to be a pervasive sense that what we're seeing is basically manufactured consent on like really a global wide scale. And the fact that this doesn't seem organic in any sense, I would say that a good term that maybe we should start resurrecting from the grave. I think what we're seeing right now is a form of counter initiation where it seems that everything that is of denoting a higher plane of ritual and spiritual existence. Sorry, it's hard to think, you know, because like so many stuff has happened. But long story short, this thing is a mass secular ritual of the new liberal religion. And I think that that's a pretty good foundation from whence we can extrapolate what's going on right now, because it seems there is a religious fervor. There is a secret sort of jeu de sens to what's happening, whether it's these people, the boomers and the millennial white women, you know, kneeling on the ground, putting their hands up and stuff. It seems so surreal that this type of discourse is happening, and I'm at a loss for words. Not to say that there is a lot of legitimate complaints, but when it comes to the race issues, but it's just viewed in history textbooks in about 2,000 years. So these illustrations, press F in the chat. Unironically, one of my favorite illustrators of all time. I mean, I don't want to talk, you know, disavow the anti-Semitism, but still one of the best. That's yeah. I'm rambling right now. So.
Well, no, it is true that people like that bring the knowledge that's in people's heads about what may potentially be wrong, even though I think that they may miss the certain respects. For example, I mean, I don't want to get on the tangent about, Israel and all this kind of stuff right now, but just to keep a long story short, like Graventus was talking about earlier, and I want to get Graventus' take soon, I think that all of this stuff is never black and white, and there's a lot of minutia that needs to be looked at in order to figure out what's going on. And that brings us to Graventus. Graventus, let us know what your take is on what's going on right now, spiritually speaking.
Yeah, I mean, there's always a spiritual component to everything. I think, you really can't, remove that from any sort of political discourse or anything. To kind of just piggyback off what Gio was talking about, this idea where these political movements, whether or not you view legitimate or not, legitimate concerns, there's been a spiritual element added to it, these kind of ritualistic, these kind of showings that you have to do. You have to perform this sort of ceremony. And we see this in kind of the like traditional religions are brought down to the secular level, the sort of the sacred becoming profane. You see these tweets by, Jesuit priests talking about, Jesus as the black man or something like that, which, it completely removes the actual real spiritual element and makes it into a political statement. And you kind of see the reversal of this, the idea of, where the political is elevated to a spiritual level while the spiritual is brought down to a mere political level. And it's kind of in the conjoining of the two in which we're seeing this, I would say this, kind of new age mystical religion that's taking form in the political discourse, even if it's not identified as such. And we see this with like the idea of secular saints, these secular martyrs, whether or not they died, legitimately for a cause that is important or not, they are heralded as these, these religious figures. I mean, it's 2 months ago with the coronavirus, we see these, this kind of false iconography of these nurses painted with halos and whatnot. I mean, there's religious element, you cannot deny that. And it's replacing, or rather filling a void that sort of existed with the breakdown of mainstream Christianity, how that's kind of collapsed. And people have this religious spiritual yearning, and this is what's filling the place. And I think it's dangerous, of course, but it's definitely a new religious experience that's coming up.
What do you think it's going to lead to? And I'm curious about Saturnalia's take, because Saturnalia, even your name Saturnalia, has to do with the god Saturn and the festival that was celebrated. Would you think that it is possible for people to, let's say, go into a more spiritual, less religious direction in the future, kind of like the idea of the New Age, Age of Aquarius, and for things to calm down there? Because I think that Graventus, you don't really think that that will be the case. So let's start with Graventus and then go to Saturnalia.
Yeah, because I see, there is that, I said before, the spiritual element, but you also have to look into the, I suppose, human players in it. They definitely want to, I would say, promote this, the people setting themselves up as these kind of new age priests, even if they're seen as, political figures, activists or whatnot. That's essentially what they are. They're these cult-like figures. And whether or not they truly believe in sort of what they're promoting, they're definitely going to benefit from it regardless. And, I don't see this headed in a positive direction. So yeah, I think we're going to see a lot more. I think we're going to see a lot more of this, and it's going to start being, if not more explicitly religious, it's going to be more implicitly religious.
Could you share some examples of cult-like figures that you see? I mean, I guess from like a political example,
Greta Thunberg.
Yes, that's a good one. Especially consider she's like 12 or something. she's definitely a face and a figure that is being heralded as, this is the face. This is the idea of the savior figure, and we could see this in other political figures or something. Anytime, probably not to an extent, but like people like Bernie Sanders or something. Even if you agree with him or not, you see this definitely a cult-like following behind him, where he can do no wrong. And this happens with all political figures to some degree.
Yeah, Mao, Lenin.
Exactly, but I think we're seeing it. I don't know. To me at least, I think it's becoming more evident in that way.
Doesn't Greta Thunberg seem more like a prop or mimetic container than a cult figure? I could see an argument maybe for Bernie Sanders, but Greta Thunberg seems like a real stretch as far as like,
yeah, well,
I
would
maybe
say,
like cult, like they people throw around the phrase cult of personality to everyone. Elon Musk's got a cult of personality. Donald Trump's got a cult of personality. Kanye West got a cult of personality. It's
Yeah,
but
Rock has a cult
Yeah,
of personality.
exactly.
you have Joe Rogan and Peter Thiel both in a comical setting. Joe Rogan's Triggered and Peter Thiel's 0 to 1.
mm-hmm.
And you got in the book Bold by Peter Diamandis, all of these collections of information promote the need to create cults, right? So I think that you have different types of cults. You have cults that depend on an infallible leader, and then you have cults that don't, right? I don't think anyone looks at Greta Thunberg as an infallible leader.
I disagree. I think that there is this innocence of the child, like in that episode with Bart Simpson, where everybody was cheering and saying, be like the boy, be like the boy. So it doesn't matter to me whether or not they're a quote-unquote puppet or whether they are actually more in control of the situation. People are going to apply something to them like a tulpa. People are going to make of them like a mirror into their own subconscious for this figure that they would want to worship. But I want to bring things to Saturnalia, because Saturnalia, you cannot stay long here today, unfortunately. So I want to get your take.
Yeah, I'd like to add that just because Greta Thunberg is, or many characters like her are pretty evidently propped up by business interests, that doesn't mean, I've seen people make some wild claims about Greta Thunberg's interests and personality and knowledge and stuff. But I think that I would like to add to what Gravantis was saying about the religion of the future being this sort of syncretic mix of the New Age, the sort of pseudo-mystic ideas. I would like to sort of bring up the idea of this sort of I guess the central mystery of the religion being presented in these protests as being this one of reversal of antinomialism, of this sort of rebellion of the subaltern, of the oppressed versus this fascist or fascistic dominating white, whatever you want to call it, these systems of control. I think that's probably a very important thing to look at. And that came off as very disorganized because I have to be out of here very soon.
Well, I'm curious about that. Gravantis, go ahead.
I was just going to say that kind of the idea of the oppressed, that's definitely the goal. But sort of the people that are profiting off it and promoting it are definitely not in the oppressed class. I saw there was a video someone had posted of a woman talking about her business having been burned down in the riots. And David Rothschild had commented on something along the line, property's not important. It's about human life. It doesn't matter. You can rebuild. And it's one of these things in which the people in power are definitely going to leverage whatever the popular sentiment is in order to hold on to it. And, sort of the idea is I'm oppressed because of certain, unchangeable reasons, whether it's my ethnicity or whatever. Even if I have this degree of power, even if have billions of dollars or whatever, I'm still oppressed in some way. That's kind of the way I'm seeing. It's a way to, I guess, bring people into the same umbrella without necessarily changing pre-existing power structures.
Well, it doesn't change pre-existing power
Definitely,
structures
yeah.
is the thing. Is that there are these grandiose claims being made of uprooting or upending this current system. And I'm not saying that's even a bad thing, but the fact of the matter is we've been doing this for decades, and the same systems are in place. There's no real change being orchestrated.
Yeah, what's the old expression? The king is dead, long live the king. It's just some steps right into the same position of power, even if you knock the other guy out.
But do you think that there are certain differences, though, which I see going both ways? Like we had the Crown Heights riot and we had the LA riots, and both of those were a lot bloodier and resulted in a lot more deaths than the riot today. On the other hand, the riot today resulted in a lot more cops and National Guard kneeling down, which I think has a symbolic significance. So I'm curious what you guys see there as far as this crossing where there's less murder, less blood, but at the same time, people seem to be a lot more passive when it comes to what's going on. So let's actually start with Serpent Mound. Serpent Mound's joining us back from the trip, wearing the really nice looking hat, and then let's go to Geo.
So are we talking about? I know I missed like the first.
Okay,
10
no
minutes
problem.
of this.
So we're talking about like the esoteric nature of what's going on, like the spiritual nature, where behind all the actions that people take, I happen to believe that there is a spiritual journey going on, different influences. So what do you see with the kneeling of the people? Let's start with that. The kneeling of the people in response to the protests.
I don't know if you guys brought this up already, but the kneeling isn't the number one thing for me. The number one thing for me that I noticed, and I tweeted about it quite a bit, and other people have as well, but the posting of the black square on Instagram, and obviously that connects to the I don't know if you would say like Saturnalian or Saturnian sort of black cube mythos that gets thrown around a lot. I know Helios is a big proponent of that, but yeah, the black cube as sort of like this metaphorical, like total evil, demonic entity, and to see that all of these people could be so, shepherded into posting just black squares. I feel like there's definitely some spiritual significance to that, almost like a mark of the beast kind of thing.
Well, I want to go to Saturnalia first, actually, because Saturnalia, you're representing Saturn right now out of all of us in a way.
Kind of. I'm a little, despite my online handle, I'm a little bit more skeptical of the sort of popular idea, I guess, of the black cube and the Saturn's hexagon. But at the same time, it is very, very uncanny. That's the exact thing that they would choose there. I mean, my sort of going interpretation of the black cube is that it represents material reality, that it's six-sided. It's like 6 electrons, 6 protons, 6 neutrons.
Which would be carbon, right?
Yeah, which is carbon-based life. And I mean, there's also the idea that you could flip it and get a hexagon, which would, I guess, interface with the rest of the universe with the magician at the center.
Or open it up and get a cross.
Yeah.
That as well.
One.
Yeah.
It almost reminds me of the. No, I'll let you.
No, Gio, I'm curious what it reminds you of.
No, it almost reminds me of the Melchevich painting. Melchevich? Yeah. The suprematists
Milevich, I think.
Milevich, yeah. He invented suprematism, if I recall, like Russian suprematism. It almost reminds me of that. It almost reminds me of Rothko's very last work, where it's the Texas Cathedral, where he just painted a series of black-blue squares. And to me, it almost represents that sort of the negative nothing, the nothing that no longer noths, to use the Heideggerian phrase. It is basically the kneel of a totally new humanity, a 0 hour, where all the signifiers have collapsed into just blackness. And I think that is sort of a popular aesthetic trend there that modern and postmodern art has carried through in the spiritual implications of such. But I don't know, that's just me like schizo posting with like, modern art, right? So, and also I would like to possibly, I'm really curious, the question I would ask Gravantis would be, what do you, like, what would be a, and I noticed Sunny is here, so that's going to be a very interesting conversation. What I'm going to ask, what do you think of the idea, or rather, what would your retort be of the idea that it was Christianity in particular that has led to the new secular religion, that by gutting Christianity in a lot of ways, that it's led directly to, like, I don't know, like, again, it's like what H.P. Lovecraft tweeted this morning, this thread about, it's a religion with no name. Let's call it like Church of No Salvation, the more bug term. What would be your hot take to counter such things? I know Sonny has a lot of ideas about that, but yeah, well, from an Orthodox perspective, what would be your take?
Well, I would say it's definitely, the inversion of Christianity, where you remove Christ from the equation completely, and you prop up and herald kind of these worldly ideas instead. As for, Christianity as a general leading to this, I think it borders on disbelief. The idea of this is kind of like a 2,000-year plot by, whoever, the Romans, the Jews, whoever you want to peg, to destroy Europe, when Europe really didn't exist as a singular whole during the time of, the Roman Empire. The idea of the barbarian at the time referred to the Germanics. That's where barbarian comes from, barbar.
Yeah.
The Greeks said that the German sounded like. So, the way things are collapsing at the moment, when Christianity is at one of its historical lows, I think that on its face kind of disproves the idea that, this is kind of a result of it.
It's Gio, you brought it up. It's the gutting of Christianity.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily, you could argue that it is Christianity, and you can get into a whole discussion about that, but that would be a stream in and of itself. But really what it is the gutting of any spirituality. Like, even if you're a pagan, whatever, however you want to identify that, most people that would identify as pagans today would be like sort of new age, very alternative thinky crystal people, and those people exactly, and they're just as spirited as any Christian for the most part. What their belief doesn't really translate into anything besides the glorification of the material world in this context. So it doesn't really matter what you believe, as long as it's he's got his little pyramid. I saw that.
Orgonite, that was invented by Wilhelm Reich. And
do you have your own orgone chamber as well?
No, not yet. I'm gonna have to build one. But for those who don't know Wilhelm Reich, they burned all his, well, not all, because we still have records of it, but the FDA destroyed a lot of his publications. And whenever that happens, it makes me think, you know what, maybe I should get this piece of orgonite, just because it makes me feel a little bit badass to get something that the FDA wanted to suppress.
Well, that's what Baps said. He said that Wilhelm Reich was right, but it's just like the perverts and the New Agers and the sexual liberation people got to his work first, and so they totally misconstrued what he was trying to get at. Right? The Freudians came and polluted. Well, I don't know. Maybe he did it to himself because he was like a Freudo-Marxist, but there was at least some kernels of like something there, right? Wilhelm Reich. Whatever.
Well, it's the same.
Possible? Do you guys think it's possible to have spirituality without religion?
No, I don't think so.
100%. Depends on what you really define as religion. Define the term.
Well, I guess religion would.
I guess I might have started thinking about religion differently, but I would define religion as a collection of traditions and rituals for social organization. So it's a thought technology anchored on certain traditions and rituals with a shared narrative. That's a thought technology designed to organize behavior.
So it has to be organized. Does that mean that it can't be changing? It can be dynamic?
Decentralized, so it doesn't have to be organized centrally, but its purpose as a tool is
but necessarily does it necessarily have to be a tool? I guess I'm not going to ask more rhetorical questions. I'll ask like an example. Are Native American traditional shamanist practitioners, do they worship do they have a religion, or is it a faith? Like, what is it like? Because people use these terms all differently. Some people say religion means it's organized. Buddhists will say we are not a religion, even though I guess by your definition they are a religion. I'm not saying your definition is wrong, but when we talk about these super abstract things, people always every single time they act like these things are like super, super, super literal and everyone knows the definition, when they all have different things and everyone tries to sort of take the lexicon and make, well, we're not a religion because religion has a negative connotation to these people, so we're going to say that we're not a religion, or we are a religion because these people want a religion, but we're not really, or we, you know what I mean?
Well,
right.
It's kind of like the difference between a tribe and and a city, like a civilization, where a tribe would just have a few members who would do their own thing, or even like a solitary monk, or like the Russian old believers who just lived somewhere in the middle of Russia and practiced a lot of incest, not incense. By the way, this is going to be brought to you by orthodoxincense.com soon. I'm in touch with the guy there. So anyway, yeah, there's like a gradient, I think, of like spirituality to religion. The more hierarchy there is, the more people who have to do all kinds of administrative tasks. I think that's my way of looking at it.
But I think to push back on Jules a bit would be that I view it differently in that certainly is a matter of fact sociological and utilitarian definition of religion. But I think that the problem with that analysis, not to say it's incorrect, but it seems that the use, to a lot of people, the use value comes first, and sort of the essentialism and the spirituality comes as after the fact. Like you see it, like, and not to pick on you, Jules, because we had this, but
I actually kind of like it.
But
Jules
no,
is a masochist.
A lot of Evo psychology thinking, which I know you're a fan of, you're a proponent of. My problem with that is it tends to sort of have this common analysis that humanity in like the pure barbarian stage got together because we had to have a use value of a community and whatnot, and religion holds us to that, blah blah blah. The whole like Steven Pinker line. My problem with that is it tends to just this pervasive utilitarian impulse, to me, just doesn't sit right with defining religion on its own terms. And I think that would be my critique of that particular analysis. As to what Sonny was saying, I would agree. I think that a lot of people do have a sort of model definition of religion, but to me, I think that religion is defined by its traditions and by its approach to the otherworldly and to God in particular. I mean, me and Gravantis, we come from the law. I'm more a Catholic, but and Gravantis is an Orthodox. So apostolic Christianity, I think, without sort of tripping on myself, I think that those traditions are important to establish what is the tradition. It has to have some degree of divine inspiration, or a large degree of divine inspiration, in order to call itself a true, at least in the theistic sense. I mean, we could argue whether what really started us down the path was Zoroastrianism and so forth. But as a Christian, I do believe that the direct inspiration from God is the most important aspect to a religion. So yeah.
But I agree with Sonny. Hold on. I agree with what Sonny was saying, and I don't use the word religion, or I don't think of it in terms of a definitive way. I think it really does depend on people's context. Like I do identify as kind of religious, or maybe even in some circumstances really religious, but I don't subscribe to like any organized religion. I think there's a lot of value, and I guess like a kind of cringe way to say it is utility in religion. But I also think evolutionary psychology explains the logic of the divine right of kings, which I'm against. Like, Gio, I know you've said before you're a monarchist. Like, I think that is not the way to go, right? That's literally the Killmonger versus the Black Panther, right? Like Killmonger,
cringe takes,
was divine. That's divine right of kings. It's divine right of kings. And that's not, I don't think that's smart. I think we've evolved past that as well, like mimetically, right? I think you don't want like strong men in chaos to be what determines how things organize. I think we have a decentralizing document, the Constitution, and people are talking about revolution and stuff. And I think what you really need is to educate people on how to pass laws and like what would be like Hail Mary laws. Like an amendment is very hard to do. the kind of synchronicity you would need for a revolution is the same kind of synchronicity you would need to pass an amendment. So why would you try to use the synchronicity for a divine right of kings when you could use the synchronicity to just pass an effective amendment?
Well, I think to push back on that, that's a lot. This is gonna sound kind of larpy, but let's go. Who cares? I think the problem is that I think the term evolution itself is what we're sort of maybe there's a sort of an air of an evolutionary process when it comes to politics and so forth. I think that the problem is rather not an evolution of society, but rather we have a society with social norms, with images of thought that have been habituated to a certain way in sort of this apparatus of secular modernity, and that to just simply go back to an understanding that people had with the monarch would be disastrous in a lot of ways, because we're dealing with a modern people. We're dealing with a modernist context. And I think that if we were to have a cultural and spiritual shift towards something that would be a society and a civilization that reflected the faith of its people, that would be different. But of course, we have to deal with the hand that we're dealt with. And I think that's a good way to sort of justify my fucking LARP fantasies. So yeah, but I think the problem again comes up with this term of evolution, because I think that linear progression, that sort of notion of Whig history, is perverse in a lot of ways. But yeah, I've revealed my spaghetti, so I will shut up now. So.
Well, you are Italian.
Just going back to the original point, which was, can you be spiritual without religion? I mean, again, if there's no agreed definition of religion or spirituality, I guess it's hard. But I think that if it means organized, I think anyone can be spiritual. I think spiritual just means you understand what God is. That's it. And I think everyone here, at least to my knowledge, could agree that they understand. I don't think it's about faith either. If you really know what God means, I don't think it's about faith. I'm pretty sure that I agree with the Orthodox person about what God is. So I don't think I disagree with him. You know what I mean? Like, God is everyone, I guess I'm a pantheist in a lot of ways, but everyone understands God, I think. And if you don't understand God, then you're not spiritual. You can be religious, I guess. You can practice rites and not be spiritual. So
I think Sam Harris has informed a lot of how I've sort of thought and kind of unraveled some of this stuff. He has a book called Waking Up, A Guide to Spirituality Without Religion. He's considers himself a militant atheist. In fact, he was in a group of like 4 guys. They called themselves the 4
Sorry, I'm
Horsemen.
having flashbacks right now.
Right?
Yeah,
it was
like
Christopher.
I'm having like post-traumatic stress.
Sorry, hold on. We'll be through soon. So you had Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchin, and Richard Dawkins, right? And they consider themselves militant atheists. And I think part of the problem is their resentment for woolly conversation. Like, they're very clinical and they like getting very granular, and they don't like being, I think they resent how like you can like interpret things in many different ways. And so they have tried to like pinpoint a very definitive definition of God, which I think has blinded them to like the tangential or parallel wisdom that you get from Hayek when he's talking about how markets work and how emergence works, right? So I think that there's this like brick wall they hit when the conversation of God comes up. And it's almost like they want people that they respect or take seriously or whatever. I don't know how they would put it. They want them to adopt different language or to use more nuanced language. And
I think for them, a lot of the time, it's not even that. It's just that they fundamentally think that Christianity is like how you would explain it to a 4-year-old. And they think it's like that forever.
Like the talking snake theory that Bill Maher likes to talk about.
Well, I think of what a lot of these people do is they will focus on the worst representatives and worst side effects of religion. And they go, what are you doing to like improve that? Because as scientists, right, you don't pay attention to the successes as much as you do to the misses, right? And I think in some instances, and I'm not an expert on this, in fact, like I'm the worst person to listen to on this, but it seems like with religion, a lot of religious people pay a lot more attention to the hits than they do to the misses. They go, look at how, like, as a heuristic, right? It's sort of like, this is good enough. Like, look at how good it is in all these instances. Look at all those people that don't have it. They don't seem to be beaming or happy or doing so well. Like, I don't want to be on that thought technology, whatever that is over there. And then so people have their own internal journey. But I think someone like Sam Harris sees himself as, you know, he has a certain social responsibility, a certain social and cultural responsibility. And I think in many ways he's like an atheist priest, right? Like I think he really is trying to uplift people and give them well-being through spirituality that then people can like have for themselves. But I think he can't wrap his head around people that in some instances are like defiantly vague and unclear.
By the way, for the 11 Jules drinking game, I'm going to take one sip every time Jules says the word like. No, every time Jules says the word right. Sorry, I get confused. So right is the key word. Everybody take a drink every time Jules says right. So, Gravantis, I wanted to ask you about this situation with whether somebody can know God or not. Because one thing that Seraphim Rose is bringing up is that how people could be potentially tricked by certain things that they see at this moment of prelist, as you call it, and that would lead to false conclusions. So could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Oh yeah, definitely. You know, I would say that everyone, you know, there's books been written on the study, kind of the idea of the infant being born, sort of having this, you know, a faith of some sort. And I think that's natural. People have a natural inclination towards God, you know, from the Orthodox perspectives, because we're made in the image and likeness of God. And that's why, you know, we already have that sort of innate thing. You know, St. Paul talks about it, you know, the law being written on the hearts of all men. You know, that's how, you know, those who don't know God through Jesus Christ, you know, that's where their judgment comes from. And, you know, people have this innate longing for it. And it's definitely easy to take advantage of it, especially to capitalize off of people's, I guess, emotional responses where they have this kind of experience of ecstasy, this, you know, hyper religious experience, to capitalize off their emotions, because it very much clouds the logical thinking. So you can be taken in, whether it's some sort of malevolent spiritual entity, or if it's, you know, someone, you know, like a false prophet, that kind of thing. So people can very much be taken in addition to the idea of the group setting. You know, if sort of everyone's a part of this, everyone's claiming this sort of religious experience or taking part in it, even that sense of wanting to be a part of it, people can get roped in that way as well.
Isn't everything a religious experience, though? Like existence itself?
Oh yeah, no, I would agree. It's just, I would say the difference is there are positive and negative religious experiences.
Oh yeah, I'll agree with that. That's a good answer.
I want to bring up, so Jules was saying how like someone like an atheist are way more likely to look at the hits rather than the misses, or the positives rather than the negatives. And I agree to a certain extent, but I think also what we define as a positive and a negative is also like very, I don't want to say subjective, because that makes it sound subjective, makes it sound like it's just determinate upon will, which isn't necessarily true. But for like someone who would be more Vedic, like Sunny or I, we could say like the slaughter of the Dacius, or for like a Christian, you could say like the Crusades, whereas a lot of atheists point to like, oh, look at the how awful the Crusades were, where if you're a Catholic, you pretty much, I mean, at least the Catholics that I've spoken to, maybe it's just my circle, but you know, generally are either neutral or supportive of the Crusades from a spiritual.
And Muslims are supportive of the jihads.
Yeah, exactly, which would be called negative or evil by an atheist.
Everyone is very very proud of their races, their ethnicities, their tribes, like conquering spirit. I mean, fucking Mongols they have a giant statue of the guy, man. I mean, everyone's proud of war and conquering. I think that it's insane that people pretend like we're not. Well, we're not supposed to.
That's what I'm saying.
A lot of Catholics pretend like they the otherwise. That's my problem, is that they don't.
Yeah.
War is evil. War is always evil. Even if you're on.
But why is it evil?
Even if it's just because it's about.
Chimpanzees can have wars.
Sure, it involves the decreasing the well-being of conscious creatures. So if you.
But isn't the decreasing? Life, okay, wait. I have a question.
Pain, like restrict freedom, all that kind of stuff.
Let's
have to be evil to win war. And I think what religious people do is to feel good about themselves because they can't deal with the like Schrodinger like conflicting things in their head. They're like, well, I'm the good guy, right? So if I'm in a war and I'm the good guy, then they're the evil one. But it's really like I think who is it that says this? Is it Wittgenstein? It's one of them. Basically,
it doesn't matter who
both
said it.
Right. They're both good. They're both evil. Even though like we could try to do some kind of utilitarian calculus for like who really has a better argument.
Yeah, but Jules, the problem is that our concept of war has fundamentally changed.
Like being opportunistic, right? What?
No, our concept of war has fundamentally changed from something that is almost like a rite of passage, is almost like a ritual, to something that's like very anti-human in a lot. Now I know it's like
I'd say it's still. I would say it's still a sacrificial right.
Evil.
Jules, you got to let Sunny in. Sunny.
But okay, if it's when we're talking about evil, I mean, I am not a dualist, so I don't. When you say evil, are you just saying like it's negative, or are you saying that it's fundamentally something that we as a society and people should universally strive to end completely? Because I think that war, death, and all of these so-called negative things are a fundamental building block of creation, and you cannot have creation and life without them. There are, you know what I mean? Like
there is one thing I would just add to that real quick. Like, for example, in the book War and Peace by Lev Tolstoy, you had a lot of these young people who were very excited about war, didn't really know what it was about, but then when they went in there, it was absolute hell and an absolute shock to the system. And I honestly think that most of the people who are sitting here maybe not Serpent Mound. Serpent Mound, if you were to go into the battlefield, I don't know, you'd probably be okay, at least physically speaking. You'd be able to hold your own.
It'd be fun as fuck to go into war. Because I believe in reincarnation, dog.
I guess it depends on what physical and mental level we are.
It's way better to die. It's way better to die impaled on some dude's spear than it is on fucking like a hospital bed.
Yeah, exactly, dude. Like one of the reasons that like historians would always talk about like how crazy the warriors were, like Germanic warriors, Scythian warriors, all of them, they believed in reincarnation. That's why they were so crazy. They didn't fear death. They knew they would come back, and they did.
Well, it's one thing to, let's say, get everybody here to be trained by Serpent Mound in a Spartan, training facility, and then go to war. You know, like they say, hard in practice, easy in combat. But regardless, when it comes to doing things like, massacring thousands of people like who are civilians who have nothing to do with the combat, that's where I would draw the line, And I would also draw the line as far as grabbing young men who don't know anything about war and just putting them in that situation when they're not psychologically prepared.
Or women.
Or women, yes.
Yeah.
I think we should strive to get rid of war entirely, but that doesn't mean simultaneously making you incapable of it, like stunting it doesn't mean stunting your abilities for war. It doesn't mean making you incapable of war.
Well, I'll agree with that.
Striving to never have it. Like, I'm very pro Second Amendment, right? I think everyone should just have guns. If everyone had guns, like everyone is capable.
This place would be
of
a paradise
evil with their
Jim
guns.
Jones.
That doesn't mean I think everyone should be like shooting people, right? I think you need equalizers in society. I think you need mimetic equalizers, and I think
Do you think that it's ever possible for society to get rid of war, though? And do you think that's desirable?
I think in the long term, if you're thinking in terms of 1,000 years, whether human beings and like our genetic descendants are still around or not, I think we'll have to scale up civilization.
What would society look like without war?
At a stage 0 civilization. I think it would. What do I think society would look like without a lot of wars? I think we'd be focusing on a lot of.
Not a lot of wars. I mean wars in general. I mean if somehow we as a society get to the point where there aren't wars, there aren't people that disagree with other people.
I think you'd have a much more decentralized. I think you'd have a much more decentralized society. That doesn't mean you wouldn't have things like murder and skirmishes.
Who do we have to kill to make that?
No, I don't think you have to kill anyone to do that.
No way, we'd be like the fields of human batteries in the Matrix. That would be the only way.
Demonstrate that there are better incentives, right? As in, you don't take something away.
Are you going to go to the Amazon jungles and convince them?
No, I'm not actually. I'm not going to do that. But
so we're talking about like
that's the point.
Are we talking about like a Brave New World type scenario where we've got most people who are at this higher, well, not higher level, but
like
just
gang
at this
wars and you have
level.
like nation wars, right? I'm talking about the macro. I'm not talking about the micro.
I understand you're talking about the macro and the micro, but
the micro is going to scale in a stage 4 civilization.
Well, the micro always
the macro goes,
reflections of each other.
You can't have any wars to have a stage 4 civilization.
Well, I wonder though.
Yeah, but Sonny made a good point. They're reflections of each other, and I think that my point of contention, and correct me if I'm wrong, but historically wars have usually been less sort of, let's call it, deadly and wide scale as we see wars in the 20th century. So again, this comes back to technology and techniques. I think that would be a reason for avoiding war right off the bat, is our capabilities to kill just a huge amount of people without people that don't have an understanding of war like a warrior does, like an ancient whether, you know, and I know Sonny brought up the context of the Bhagavad Gita, where it's like you must because there is duty and you have to. But I think that context is completely gone. Like even soldiers themselves nowadays, a lot of them are sort of brought up by the bureaucratic state to perform very specific, specialized tasks. The idea of the warrior is sort of left modernity. You could argue World War I, World War II, but I don't know. I just don't think that the mantle of the warrior has sort of left us, and I think that would be a good impetus to avoid war. Because nowadays we don't have that same understanding.
I see warriors in urban cities right now, and they're trashing shit. So I think warrior spirits still exist. I think people who don't give a fuck and want to wreck shit.
You tweeted about this, right, Sonny? You tweeted about this, if I recall. Yeah.
What? It also, I mean,
you tweeted about this, about how a lot of these like. Yeah.
in a spiritual context, we can also look to Islam and the concept of jihad, where, you know, jihad is
struggle
necessarily an external; it's also an internal. So, like that's what Gio was talking about. Like you could be like a 56%, like lay 56%, like Goblina sitting in Iowa and like drone strike a bunch of Taliban people. That's not.
It's like a fucking video game.
Yeah, it's like a video game. Like that's not war. Like that's not a warrior.
No.
But the only like war that is tenable or morally tenable at least would be like that spiritual internal jihad.
Stanley Kubrick, I think Stanley Kubrick kind of predicted it with A Clockwork Orange, where you have a civilization that I remember reading somewhere.
But I have a good response to that. Okay, because I wrote this article for the Autistic Mercury. This was a year ago. This was when you had the 2 shootings happen, the leftist and the Paul Larper at the same time. I argued that Stanley Kubrick was right, but he was off the mark with Anthony Burgess was right, who wrote A Clockwork Orange, but he was off the mark in that he would predict these like nihilistic, rebellious youth gangs, and they have like the Vietnam stomping boots, just ready to destroy modernity. I think he's wrong in the sense that it's no longer a group. It's like the mass. It's like the school shooter. It's the lone wolf. Like that. I think even the terrorists we have nowadays are indicative of a profoundly impoverished spiritual age. I know that sounds like a totally messed up point, but it's like we can't even have like the terrible youth gang anymore. It's the incel shooter, the van attacker, the lone wolf.
But we're having the gangs now, though.
Because what?
We're having the gangs now, though. I mean, we're
not
having
them.
Exactly.
But again, that's a different. Yeah, go ahead, Sonny. Sorry, I cut you.
No, I was just saying, like, I think that all of these, I don't think that this spirit, this whole thing has really left us, and I don't think that meta war, just because it's meta, really means that it's not war. I think war, as like, it's war in English, I think should take on the same meaning that jihad does. I mean, it is. If we look at like old texts in English, that's how it's used. It's a struggle, right? So I think that war is again, it's a fundamental element of creation. It's not something that if you want to strive to get rid of war, that's fine. That's good for you. But you're taking a side. And I think that a lot of people refuse to realize they're taking a side instead of just being able to see that there's two sides in the first place. They just think that there's one good and that's it. But the other side, nothing would exist. The universe wouldn't exist if there wasn't death. The universe wouldn't exist if there wasn't struggle. If there wasn't a struggle for creation, it would just be chaos. There wouldn't be anything.
Very interesting take on comparing war to the word jihad. I could see that. I think getting rid of war would mean, in a lot of ways, educating everyone about war, like in a way that we just don't do. I think that
war is really bad.
Culture a lot. I think we need to elevate the culture a lot. I think if you're watching anime, I think if you're like some of the cartoons they even make now, or just the television shows, the adult television shows,
but isn't that a reflection of our times? Like, I think war is bad too. I don't think all these things are good per se, but they're fundamentally necessary to exist. And I think that railing on them as like a fundamental belief system it's just pointless, because you're saying it's almost like rebelling against God, against creation itself.
It's almost a Gnostic concept, the way that Eric Vogelin frames it. It is a immanentization of the eschaton. It's a secular Gnosticism to say that we could just have a utopia and the war and conflict will just go away.
Well, let me ask. You can't have a utopia. You can never have a utopia.
I want to ask this to Gravantis.
You can get an extropia, though. You can get an extropia.
Gravantis, during the time when we get to New Jerusalem, are we going to become soldiers fighting on behalf of Jesus Christ against the principalities of darkness?
Well, I mean, that's what Scripture says. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, against principalities, powers, rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. That's kind of the focus and where the direction is. I see, I guess, kind of the idea of the rioters, these kind of people who don't really have necessarily a purpose. They're just smashing stuff. I mean, that's the same level as like the militant atheists. They're not fighting for something. They're fighting a negation of something.
I think they're fighting for something.
But what are they fighting for? They're just. I mean, I don't
think they really need to be able to verbalize like a reason. Like, I don't think you could ask chimpanzees and be like, "What the fuck are you fighting for, you dumbasses?" Like, I wasn't even trying to be racist. I was just commenting, but
I wasn't trying to be racist.
There was a monkey recently that stole a vial of that, like the coronavirus.
Yeah, you think that thing was trained? Yeah. You think that thing was like did you see the monkey on the bike that grabbed a young child and tried to run off with it? You think these monkeys... Have you ever seen the monkey? What are those monkeys that used to like dance with the thimbles to like the circus?
Monkeys. Yeah.
People have remembered how to train some monkeys and like send them in. Or do you think they
monkey
just
warfare.
happen to go into the lab and like take samples, just like a total fluke?
Well, we're going to be at the, somebody was saying that you can get a Zootopia, but not a utopia. So as far as the furries being able to, we're back to furries again, by the way, as far as furries being able to have their dreams come true, and instead of wearing the mascot uniforms, being to actually transform into the pink wolf that they've always wanted to become. Like, that's going to be a very interesting time to be alive. You know, with that and sex dolls and all kinds of other things. But we were talking before about if there is this lack of a structural religion, something for people to grab onto that talks about things that have gone on in the past, then what is going to be the moral capacity of the people who are going to be putting on these or having these surgeries to become furries? Like, when they're not gifting, what else is going to be occupying their time?
God.
What do you mean? What else do you need?
What else do they do? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you get tired from yiffing, so I guess it's going to be yiffing and then eating from the dog bowl and sleeping, and then that's it. But then at that point, you've gone down to the animal stage. And
once you've reached the sublime object, where else is there to go, right?
Well, that's an interesting thing. Like, I can imagine a future where the furries are just going to be, like, on all fours. Like, they're going to devolve back into the animals. That they were inspired by.
Like the South Park episode, right? Back in the day.
Yeah, when Kyle's dad wanted to be a dolphin, and yeah, that was pretty scary.
I think oh God, how to make a mature point out of that? What I was gonna say before, I think that to get to our discussion about the warrior spirit and so forth, I think that, and the perversions of that spirit, I think a good transition to the original topic would be that to examine the claims of what is motivating these racial-based riots. I think at the heart of it is specifically a metaphysical claim. And I've tweeted about this before, but not just me, but other people like John Milbank and so forth have come up with this similar analysis, in that a lot of critical race theory at its heart has sort of a kind of, I would say, secular material metaphysics in terms of intergenerational trauma and concepts such as that. I think it's an entirely valid claim. But then of course nowadays within very rootless cosmopolitan academia, they would say oh, that's bad because you're saying it's really religion, right? I'm like, no, it's a valid point to make that a lot of these claims are metaphysical. And of course, a lot of the critical race theory people, they say they use the sort of language of genetics and so forth. But then there are other ones, the more postmodernists, for example, I forget his name, but he wrote that book Necropolitics, which I think is sort of a good read and a good understanding of where they come from. I think that at the heart of it, when you talk about intergenerational trauma, whether it's Indigenous people here in Canada or whether it's Black Lives Matter and so forth, I think that these are metaphysical claims and we should confront them, or rather we should understand them as such. And that's an entirely valid analysis, because we are dealing with the spiritual war as much as we're dealing with an info war. So yeah.
I mean, one of the things that people always seem to, at least on the right, which is, I mean, I've been fucking arguing with people for a week now, is that nothing that anyone in Black Lives Matter or these groups are saying is really fundamentally wrong. I don't really understand. For instance, cops are probably racist, because they're 100 IQ.
Yeah.
You cannot have over 110 IQ to be a cop. They do an IQ test, and if you have too high of an IQ, they kick you off. And then if you want to rise to the ranks as a cop, it's not like the military where you take an IQ test and they say, oh, well, you should probably not go to the front lines. You should probably go work, on the computer servers or whatever. It's just you become a cop and then you rise up the ranks. So even the police chiefs of every single police station in this whole country is, about 104 IQ average. So I think that these people are racist and probably pretty dumb. They're not the best to make decisions. And again, Black people average IQ in America 84. So you have this sort of discrepancy where they think they're smarter than Black people, but a lot of Black people are still 100 IQ. They're still average IQ to the mean white median population. And in regards to that, why are these people defending the police state, the police apparatus, and also why do they want integration? I thought I am sort of maybe I'm a traditionalist when it comes to race issues, but I don't believe in segregation or integration. I'm a segregationist. I believe in stuff like Malcolm X. I'm totally cool with giving like the entirety of the South to some sort of, black coalition. There's some population swap that goes down like fucking Turkey and Greece or some shit. There's historical precedent for it, but everyone just wants to bitch about it. And I think that in a lot of ways, the black people are fighting something that they really do think exists. They think Jewish people and the government and all these people are white people, and we sort of have the same enemy as black people. And if you,
what does that mean?
What
does that mean?
What does what mean?
Oh God, here we go.
What does that mean? What does that mean?
What does what mean? Which one? I'll tell you. Which one?
You said, who's the common enemy between people that should be segregated?
I think the common enemy of the world is people who seek to bring the world into one global entity. People like the UN, NATO, all of these supranational organizations that
international finance.
Yeah, international finance. Or we can just say we can get rid of the nuance and just
why should they be, even though I think that's kind of a really rough way to put it. Why should people that want a one world government be a common enemy to anyone?
Do you think that you want to be run by people who live in Venezuela?
I don't.
Are you okay with that? Why not? No, I'm answering your question. Do you think that sub-Saharan Africans should run the world and decide every single facet of how you live? Do you think that Chinese villagers in fucking Wuhan
I don't think this is answering my...
It's 100% answering your question because I'm answering with rhetoric, and
but
I want you to really think about it.
But what if those people were on a council with world leaders all over the world?
Who decides?
Each nation elects their...
How does each nation decide? So every nation has to be democratic.
Non-direct democracy.
But Jules, I thought you liked decentralization, though. That's kind of...
Yeah, this requires
I don't like
massive
the idea of a one world government, but I think that there's a lot of really smart people who are not enemies who think that
I think they're 100% enemies if they believe in globalism. If you're a globalist, you're completely an enemy to the common person. If you believe that people should not have the right to self-sovereignty and self-determination and to be allowed to just fuck off and not pay taxes and do whatever the fuck they want, you're an enemy to common people. People that just want to be fucking left alone, be on their property, and just chill the fuck out and do whatever the fuck they want.
You wanting to be left alone is depriving people of innovation that could make their lives better, because this is the perspective.
How is it depriving people? If you want to have a little fucking cult that does some fucking techno research, I don't give a shit. But I live on a farm and I want to stay on the farm and do whatever the fuck I want. I don't like paying taxes. I don't like being deprived of my First Amendment right. And you know what's going to happen if there is a global world government? We're the only fucking country in the world that has a Second Amendment. You talked about the Second Amendment.
That's true.
What happens under a world government? Every single fucking other country in the whole world bans guns except us, and you can't even own a pistol in half of the fucking municipalities of this country. So in what fucking world is... I mean, most globalists seem to be American globalists. Let's be honest. They're American ultranationalists who are insane, and they think that the world government, if there ever is one, is going to be like fucking Futurama or some shit where it's going to be America and everyone can own guns and everyone has free speech. That's not going to happen. It's going to be someone like China, and if you say anything on the internet, they're going to come to your house and put you in a fucking jail cell, or they're just going to kill you. They're going to send you to a gulag. There's nothing good that can ever come out of globalization, and anyone who is on that side is an enemy to common people. Everyone, every single person you see in the government is an enemy.
What about people just having wrong-headed ideas? I don't think everyone that has a bad idea is an enemy. And I think that
they're an enemy that could be turned into a friend. Remember that I'm not a dualist. I'm not a dualist. Because I say enemy, I'm not saying they're evil. I don't think they should be killed. I just think that their ideas are juxtaposed. Like I said, you said that war is not something that we can ever get rid of. You agree with that. But you said that we should strive to get rid of it. That means that people who agree with war are an enemy of yours. That doesn't mean you want them all killed, obviously, but they're people that can be converted or shown to see the other side. So when I say enemy, I don't mean kill them. I mean they and their ideas and what they propagate goes fundamentally against the core principles, ideas, and basically just morality of common people who just want to be left alone.
These are people that want to, a lot of these one-worlders, I don't think are like the vampires in Castlevania, all right? I think a lot of these one-worlders see themselves as utilitarians, and they want to maximize the well-being of conscious creatures, and they want to uplift everyone. And they, I think, have overestimated the potential for AI, and they think that with a council of elders, just like religious people talk about from time
Elders
to time,
of Zion,
whatever, right? Just like religious people talk about, hey, we should just have elders and wise people. Like, I think people that advocate for one world government, a lot of them just think we should have like council of elders assisted by like a souped up bureaucratic system that runs on artificial intelligence to like get rid of all the kind of lower level bureaucrats, right? And they think that would optimize what are currently a lot of inefficiencies with mega bureaucracies. And so they think...
Let me ask you a question about the idea of like utilitarianism. The idea of if we're maximizing the greatest benefit for the greatest amount of people, a situation in which, say, you know, there's one perfectly healthy person who's sick, and there's, you know, sort of several people who are maybe a detriment to society. What would stop utilitarian for saying these people are a detriment to society? They take more than they produce. Why don't we harvest the good organs that they have in order to maximize the benefits for the maximum amount of people? Say one person is sick,
they fucking do
that. Harvest their organs and distribute them to a wide society. I think this is
why I'm not an organ.
The idea of utilitarianism and these like idea of this government, like idea of creating this utopia is there comes a point in which these people who, you know, they may have good motives, they want to promote a better world, and they see some people who are just not going to go along with it, you know, and at what point does it come in which someone is so much a detriment to this sort of one world society in which it would benefit all of us if we got rid of them and we start eliminating these groups of people? And I mean, we see this in these totalitarian governments where, you know, some people may have had good motivations in the Soviet Union and, you know, communist China, that we're going to make a brand new society. However, we need to get rid of these people. And there comes a point in which, you know, utopia can't be built except with a river of blood. You know, there's going to be a point in which wholesale people are going to be wiped out in order for this kind of ephemeral idea of this utopia on Earth. And I think that's kind of the problem, that, you know, people are inefficient. You know, that's just what people are. You know, people, we have emotions. We don't all think logically. We're not robots. And I think this is kind of the idea when we take the abstract too far, is that we forget about humanity itself and the fact that, you know, some people are just going to do what they want, you know, regardless of how much logic you're going to throw at them. So I think that's kind of the danger in sort of ignoring the actual humanity of a single person in favor of kind of like this broader ephemeral sense of humanity as a whole.
I wanted to get my take in here real quick, which is I think that there can be a balance between freedom of association, which we had in the First Amendment, while at the same time having an open door for people who happen to be different, who come from a different place but want to integrate into the culture, to be able to come in and be welcomed, just as long as they, again, play by the same rules that everybody else is playing by within that culture. I think that that's a very achievable balance, but it seems like history has so far strayed extremely one way, extremely the other way. Going back about the Jews, ancestors of mine who were living in the Pale of Settlement were constantly being attacked during the pogroms. You know, completely innocent grandmothers just being slaughtered by actually my father's line ancestors. My father is actually the guy who was, my father's ancestor is the guy who was writing the note to the Sultan in that very famous painting by, I don't recall, Ilya Repin, I think his name is. Do you guys know the painting I'm talking about?
You have a relative who's in a Repin painting?
Yes, I do. Yes.
No way.
Yeah,
Whoa.
it's the guy who's writing things down, but writing that message to the Sultan. But anyway, my point is that, like I said in an earlier podcast that we did, I really believe that that's the kind of shit that led to a lot of the Jews who were living there to adopt communism as a way out, which ended up making things millions times worse for everybody in the long run. So I don't think that when it comes to adopting more of a warrior mindset, you need to go after the poor fucking old ladies. Like, if you want to be a warrior, go after other warriors. Live by the sword, die by the sword.
Wait a second.
Like
but
Cuomo,
isn't
108
countries
kick them? No, I'm not gonna do it. No.
Yo, by the way, I'm very pro-Jewish. I'm very pro-Israel. If I dated or married someone that was Jewish and I had to convert, I would have no problems converting. Like,
hell yeah.
Let me go and read the chat right
now. Jewish people are great. They're really smart. They have an awesome culture. And I think that, like, I actually am disgusted by anti-Semitism. I think, just like everyone, you should be able to, like, bust each other's balls and, like, be like, hey, let's have a fucking elevated conversation. But I do not like people getting the wrong impression at all. I don't like people getting the wrong impression at all. And I think scapegoating is disgusting and it should be avoided at all costs. In fact, there's just no reason for scapegoating ever.
Someone in the chat just asked if we've read Siege by James.
Well, I also noticed that, for example,
read Siege.
Okay, one thing that I do notice a lot is that because there is this meme of, like, literally shaking whenever these things get brought on, it does feel like the more people react in a very school teacher way to a lot of this stuff, the more it's going to be brought up. So there's no helping that. I understand what kind of world we're living in right now where this is very popular, and I'm going to try as much as I can to contrast that with the idea that so many Jewish people have been fucking guardians of Western civilization despite the ones who have gone, like, total ultra-leftist. And I think it's always going to be the case, unfortunately, that Jewish people are going to be pushed against. And like I said in an earlier podcast, if you're a white supremacist who doesn't want the Jewish people to exist anymore, all you need to do is just completely ignore them and not do anything, and they're just going to, become part of everything. It was the 1,000 years of pressure that has been going on, which I think has resulted in what we have today. What is
that, Lev? Is that
what
like
if we just want to be fucking left alone, though? What if we just want to be left alone? That's all most people want. They just don't want Jews coming into their country. That's all. Is that so much to ask?
No, that is too much to ask, because if we're talking about freedom of association, that's one thing. But if we're talking about having what I would prefer, an open door for people, regardless of where they happen to come from, to be able to integrate into society, let them integrate into society. Why not?
But why?
But hold on. What are you talking about? Are you talking about? I think.
But Lev,
I don't think if someone wants
that we need open borders.
Can I move to Israel? Can I move to Israel? Open borders for Israel.
Listen. Let's talk about the baker, right? I think that's a very interesting case, because I don't think if you're a Jewish baker and someone came in and was like, make this Nazi cake, I don't think you should have to make that cake at all. I think you should be able to tell those people to go fuck themselves and go away. But also, if you have someone that's religious and they're like, I don't want to make a gay cake, or I don't want to make a transgender cake, I don't actually know why there's a legal argument for, like, you have to make this cake that they wanted to make. If you're wearing a MAGA hat in New York, bars are allowed to kick you out, right? And that's not even just because they have a no hat. I'm just talking to our audience, actually, right? I think that if you're wearing a MAGA hat and you're in a New York bar, they're allowed to kick you out. So there's a difference between being like, hey, this is my property, this is my bar, this is my cake shop, this is how I do things, and you can be as uncouth and disagreeable and abrasive or just whatever, just disgusting as you want, right? And we'll see how that works out for you.
But
as far as then, like, a national policy that then also can kind of have these, like, runoff side effects of xenophobia and bigotry, it's like you can like it sounds like you're really close on the just, like, defiantly bigotry line. as that's like how you're ensuring your autonomy and freedom. It's like, well, if I want to be a bigot, like, you shouldn't be able to stop me. And I think there's like, while there's kind of a logic there, like I think that society and culture, like you should expect to have a very responsive and strong, like, codifying, like,
but to push back on that, like, I know I'm joking and memeing and whatnot.
Some nuance and compassion.
Wait, let Gio speak.
Well, no, to push back, maybe Jules, on your point and Lev's point, I think that, with the risk of sounding stupid, why is it that these things have taken on such a knee-jerk reaction in most normies, most people, to the point of like losing your job and being a total social outcast? Like, why is it that we must enforce to the point of people's private conscience that they cannot be quote unquote bigots or racists or xenophobic? Like xenophobic originally, I think, is just a neutral term. Like, most societies throughout the world, you could classify as xenophobic. And to push back a bit on Lev's point, I think that having borders and enforcing them to the point of having a sense of cultural and ethnic solidarity within people of a certain country, I think that's valid. And I think that the vast majority of the world agrees with that. It's just that for the last sort of few centuries, us in the Western world, we've sort of got these universalized notions of, well, you know, maybe we should have a mosaic, like, multicultural society. Even like, here's the problem. My biggest problem is that if you look at certain like utopian fiction or certain trade books in the 90s, I have one about like clothes and like digital technology. They talk about the mosaic society, how people can have their own unique differences within a shared space and so forth. Nowadays, multiculturalism has gone way beyond that to pervasive homogenization. We no longer even have like this 90s world music utopianism where everyone gets their own little corner, everyone gets their own little ethnic shop. Nowadays, it seems that we have to agree that everyone has to have this pervasive, global liberal consensus. And that's my problem. But furthermore, I think, why is it that it's such a problem that private people within their own heads are like, well, I don't like Jews, or I don't like whatever. I understand, like, it's offensive. I understand that it's not good to harbor an irrational hatred towards people. But at the same time, it's like, I really don't. We know that thought doesn't translate easily into action. So why is it that people think that, oh, well, if they don't like a certain Jew, then that means they're gonna have another Holocaust? It's like, you know what I mean? Like, I risk of canceling myself. I risk of sounding offensive. I'm just asking open question, right?
Well, those are two very extreme points. I think that the example you were giving with having like a multicultural society, I think that is also a very extreme point where people are not integrated into something that unites all of them. To contrast that, I have a friend of mine who's living in Norway. She's originally from Pakistan, and she goes to all the national festivals, waves the flag, puts on the Norwegian costume, and she fully integrated, even though she has like a statue of Ganesh or whatever, she fully integrated into the life of being a Norwegian.
Yeah.
Now, as far as
she's not a Norwegian.
She's not a Norwegian in terms of blood, but I'm sorry, man, but as far as having a law that says if you are of a certain ethnicity, you are not allowed to participate.
I am a Zionist for every other race on the world.
And look, maybe some places, some cities. Okay, look, if there's like a city in China or Japan or somewhere where they want to implement those things, that's fine. But we already have multicultural cities that I would prefer at this point to be, as far as what they gravitate towards, to have the ones that are in the West gravitate towards Western values and have that be what dictates the rest and have people integrate into those values.
I like Minister Farrakhan.
What if we just ship them all out?
Talks about Minister Farrakhan says
that's against the non-aggression principle.
I don't believe in that.
Hold on. Minister Farrakhan says, I'm not anti-Semite, I'm anti-termite, right? And then he got kicked off of whatever he got kicked off of. And I really wonder what he's talking about. Like, is he talking about the Cuomos too? Like, who's he talking about, right? I think that it's very important to get very, very, very specific, right?
I don't think it's that important because it is just the Jews. You can just fundamentally boil it down to it. There's this one single group of Jews that exists. It's not all of them, but it is one single group, and they're all Jewish.
What are you talking about?
The Rothschilds,
They're
dude.
Irish, bro. They're all Irish.
What are you talking about?
So I think
you think it's like a so.
Do you know how
so
the banking? Do you know how the International Monetary Fund works?
What about the Rockefellers? Are the Rockefellers Jewish?
Tell me how it works.
Crypto Jews.
So I think one of the biggest issues in this whole conversation is
that you're anti-central banker. So you're anti-central banker.
100%.
Okay. Why don't you say that?
They're all the same families. They're all the same families.
I'm not
it's one
sure
little
about
tribe.
That. I'm not sure.
I'm 100% sure. It's people. No. It's people who are following this one single specific tribe, and people who are their lackeys, and that's it. All the money comes from one specific group. I'm not saying all Jews are bad. I don't think all Jews are bad. I don't think that. That's stupid. Again, I think that Jews should be proud of who they are. I think everyone should be proud of who they are. But there is one single group of Jews, and if they were Papuan, I would probably say I don't like Papuans. But that doesn't mean I want to kill all of them. But it does mean that the Papuans control every single fucking central bank in the world. That's what that means.
But as a solution for that, you want to
anti-central bank. So that's why decentralize the currency, Bitcoin. Hello.
But as a solution for that, you want to
the market provides.
You want to force them out of wherever they happen to live, and not just that one group you're talking about, but painting a broad brush. You want to do it to all of them.
I don't think it's ever going to happen. It's just idealism.
What are we going to do, right? You can't just be like, oh, no more central banks, unless you replace
but don't we already
exactly because you'll get killed.
You have to seamlessly do it. No, not because you'll get killed. No.
Every person who's tried to do it has been murdered. So I think you'll get killed.
I don't think so.
I think we already have sort of an ersatz tribalization within these cities as well, and that's only going to increase. Here's the thing. Look, I may offend people, or I may offend now the other side, which is I don't consider myself an ethnic nationalist in the sense of I don't identify with the predominant values of the country that I live in. There's a lot of things I admire about Canada, but in terms of the current regime and the current ways of looking at the world, I do not sort of abide by a lot of Canadian-style liberalism. But that being said, I do agree to the extent that everyone should feel a sense of ethnic pride within themselves, and they should have their own nation and their own people. I don't think that's a controversial take, but
I also believe that one country and one nation. That's it.
Well, no, but like Sunny was saying, I think
so. You're anti-Israel, like the far leftists. Is that what you're saying?
No, I just said I said one country, one nation. I support Zionists if they stay in Israel.
Yeah.
I don't understand.
But like Sunny was saying, there's no possibility.
I don't know the whole Zionist, anti-Zionist thing. It's all fucking gibberish to me.
No, I understand what Sunny is saying.
You're never going to, here's the thing, you're never going to have the ethno-state, you're never going to kick out all the immigrants, it's impossible.
Yeah, I agree. It will never happen, but I'm still an idealist, and I refuse to stop being an idealist and a romantic.
But one thing, but Sunny,
I also don't like central
banks. One thing that you could do without talking about plans that would, let's say, forcefully get rid of people who would prefer to stay there is have the kind of policies implemented that the people who would prefer to live under those kind of policies would want to stay there, and the people who don't.
It's never going to happen.
Well, we're seeing
democracy is a joke. It's never going to happen. America has not been a free country for probably more than 100 years. It's never going to happen. This country is not free. Democracy is not free. The only thing that you can realistically change is local politics, and that's it.
We're seeing right now how the failures of the multicultural society, how people you literally had to send in the National Guard to forcibly desegregate schools. I believe in Alabama it was.
Yeah, even black schools.
Yeah, even black schools. But now we see a lot of the the BLM and I wouldn't even say black nationalists because they're not really black nationalists, but advocating for POC spaces. Yeah, well, no, I have no beef with Hoteps. I love Hoteps. Those guys are cool. But yeah, they are based. But it's people naturally that's just a natural inclination. They all will say, "Hey, we want spaces that are POC. We want spaces without white people." Like, we want to be just surrounded by our own people. And
yeah, that's chill as fuck.
Yeah, exactly. But that's what people would argue against while saying that. But if you're white, you can't say that.
Yeah.
And that's the issue. But what I was gonna
you can say that you need situational awareness.
What I think
that comes with.
But their retort would be that there is a historic precedent with white people enslaving and oppressing and holding. The system itself is built upon a racialized, racist structure. That would be their retort. So they're like, well, we need POC spaces because
what system hasn't? What system hasn't for millennia? That's been the norm.
That's the thing. Every system has a predominant race and a predominant worldview. Welchalong, you know what I mean? But I agree that historical oppression is real. And if they did have their own autonomous spaces, I believe that's a good thing. But I think this is a problem. But again, this is like we're going in circles, it seems, to the same tract of dealing with politics within a liberal framework. And I think that is what sort of frames the debate from the beginning. And you know what I mean, between like the ethno-nationalists and whatnot, you know what I mean, globalism and so forth. It seems that we're just going on the same tracks, put it that way.
Well,
because we have a framework that's given to us as imposed upon us within modernity, obviously. So here I may sound like a Sood saying that, but I realize the tone of my voice sounds kind of Soodish, but I think that's, again, this is a big problem with the understanding between people, is that we are given a certain set of worldview and ideological tools to deal with, and that's. Sorry, Lev.
I wanted to say that I'm the Sood. You're not the Sood. I'm the Sood, and I wanted to bring this conversation. Yeah, Serpent Man. You know what I'm talking about. And I want to bring this conversation to Drew Arnold as well. Going back to the spiritual aspect of this, if people feel that things aren't going to go like how I'm hopefully predicting, where people are going to be able to integrate into society and not just be there as just living without contributing anything to society, but actually contributing to society, living there, and anybody who doesn't want to contribute could get out. Like, that's a fine society to me. I have no problem with that. And also I am a big fan of having an open door to whoever the hell wants to contribute to that society. I'm sorry, I don't see anything good about artificially limiting it, because again, it's like, if we're talking about a cosmopolitan city or whatever, you have a lot of people there. Some people may want to hang out with people who happen to be different from them. Some may not. I'm not going to have a legal
What would you
precedent.
say about Trump's Muslim ban? What would you say about Trump's Muslim ban?
What Muslim ban?
Lev.
It wasn't because they're Muslim. That's just like a talking point.
But Lev, what would you say about that?
Well, the Muslim ban, like Sunny said, it was not because they were Muslim. It was specific countries that were sponsoring terrorism, going back to the Obama administration's classification of what those countries were.
So, but it ignored Saudi Arabia, which is our biggest ally.
You think that's just
it? Fuck Saudi Arabia.
Well, that was just it as far as what it was legalistically speaking. As far as him calling it a Muslim ban, sure, that can have other meanings to people.
What I was going to bring up earlier when we were having that discussion, and this relates back to what we were talking about with war as well. Like, you talk about borders and not letting anyone into your cities, not letting anyone into your country or your society. Like, I'm of the opinion, and I bet Sonny would also agree with me here, that in modernity, like, we don't have, like a nation itself is an aberration. Like, the idea of, well, we would choose which people to let in and which people to not let in. Like, the fact that would even be a decision means that something's already gone horribly wrong.
Yes, I agree.
Is your country like we always joke about it, but these are all discussions that you have when your conception of a nation is just an economic zone.
Homo economist as well, the conception of a people within a nation.
Yeah, exactly. Like it shouldn't be people within a nation. It should just be people. And that's my opinion. Like, the fact that would even be a discussion of, well, these are the people that we let in our borders. These are the people that we don't. And the fact that decision wouldn't be made by the people. That decision would be made by the, I guess, overlords of the people. Because, we're saying, what would people allow? What would the powers that be allow? We're not saying what would the actual people do. And that's where it really comes down to.
Yeah, I agree.
And I just wanted to bring something up, the idea of multiculturalism, how sort of the idea of melting pot, all the cultures come together. What it essentially does is make every single culture or difference extremely shallow. You see people talk about, I want to cut immigration to Mexico. And then the immediate point is, well, don't you like tacos? Don't you want a sombrero? That is what the Mexican culture is reduced to. We see this in the term of person of color. Okay, well, so that incorporates Filipinos, the Han Chinese, Nigerians, Colombians, all in this kind of this like amorphous group that, it removes any sort of legitimate and real difference between these groups. And, we're all supposed to unite under Coca-Cola, McDonald's, that's kind of the pervasive
world, yeah.
You don't have to answer this, but does that also apply to racial? Does that apply to like race mixing?
In what sense?
In the sense that when you dilute or sort of trivialize race when it comes to reproduction, where you say, well, it doesn't matter who you breed with, then is that also trivializing race to the extent that you're saying, where it just makes it a series of adjectives rather than something real?
Yeah, I think so. I think that, I think it goes too far, the sense that, race doesn't exist. It doesn't matter, when it's clear that there are, substantial, there's are differences between people. I mean, on a genetic level too.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we can't argue with people that don't acknowledge a fact like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think wait, really quickly, one sec. I just want to say one thing I've noticed is that people, and I do think that everyone in this chat is above average IQ, and I think that one pitfall that people who are above average IQ fall into is they assume that there are not people with 70 IQ who will take a hammer and smash your head in it for not believing for not believing what they believe. And that's the majority of Earth. That's the majority of people. And that's probably the majority of what it's going to always be. So there's nothing that you can really do about that.
That reminds me of, the kind of stories where, so this enlightened urbanite liberal, normally woman who decides, I'm going to go to the Middle East, or I'm going to go to Africa.
Side. Why'd you throw that brick through our window? We're on your side.
Exactly. I'm going to go X, Y, or Z, and they wind up dead in a week.
They get beheaded in Pakistan.
But that's the thing, right? Like, I mean, full disclosure, I am attracted to women of a lot of different races, but at the same time, I have to contend with the reality that Italian people are basically disappearing, right? Like, the Italian birth rate is the lowest in all of Europe.
Redheads too.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, it's like in some ways you have to think about that. It's like, I want to be, like, as much as I am attracted to women of a different ethnicity, I have to factor in terms of family and cultural understanding and so forth. It's like, damn, it's like, if I had a choice,
and Gio,
but I don't have a choice because I'm a frat incel. But it's like, but it's like at the end of the day, you have to really look at these decisions. Say, if I want a family, do I want to carry my people within to the future, right? And that's the thing. Like, and that's a perfectly valid thing.
And not to cut you off, Gio, but
go ahead. I'm rambling. So,
let me ask you this as well, and this gets back to my contention of sort of a peoples versus a nation. So you said Italians. Are you suggesting that like a Milanese person and a Sicilian?
That's the thing, right?
Yeah, an Italian. Like, what is an Italian?
Yeah, exactly.
And then that's the question.
But that's the thing. Like, half my family is like pure Roman middle. Like central Italy, right? But the other half is like the most Greek part of Calabria. Mm-hmm. So I'm probably Greekoid, right? Like even my mother's maiden name is Greek, right? So it's like, you're right. What is an Italian? So that's why I believe in the E. Michael Jones. I know I'm cucking right now. I'm whatever, but I do believe that ethnos is something like E. Michael Jones says. There's something there that is sort of transcends the mere biological. But again, the mere biological does play a role because Mediterraneans do share a lot of similarities, right? So, but that's the thing. That's what I'm saying. It's valid to think about these things. And I don't think you're a racist if you prefer someone, if I could get my perfect Italian GF, right?
The Med GF, yeah.
The Med GF that brings me olives and so forth. So
I want to get Drew Arnold into this conversation, but right before that, I just wanted to quickly ask if you're talking about there being an ethnos where, let's say, in the periphery of this ethnos, you would have, let's say, other people who would be able to come in and contribute, so long as, let's say, the ethnos itself, like, perpetuates its own culture and nothing stops that from happening. Would you personally, Gio, have an open door policy for other people wherever they happen to come from? Again, as long as we don't have like an overly large amount of immigrants already, would you be okay with people?
You'd have to severely limit the number of immigration, both legal and illegal, that happens now. I'm in favor of that, but
Sure.
But I think that as long as you keep other populations not to the point where they're going to disrupt the demographics of certain places, I think that's perfectly fine. I think that to an extent, multiculturalism and globalization are somewhat inevitabilities, and they have, produced at least some cross-cultural betterments. But at the same time, I think it's not wrong for an immigration policy to exist to benefit a certain people that is a predominant people within their own land. Of course, in North America, this is confused, obviously. I'm talking about European or a non-North American context, because in North America, I mean, the ship has sailed. Multiculturalism, unfortunately, and some extent fortunately, is here to stay, but it's how we deal with that is always going to be that alchemical stone problem. And I think this is where a lot of our issues in the modern world, a good chunk of our issues that we are facing nowadays, it always comes back to this question. We're dealing with the North American context, obviously. Like in Europe, and this is the problem, is the Americanization is globalization. Even Europeans are thinking in terms of American politics. I think that's terrible.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Like the BLM protests? Like, what the fuck are these motherfuckers doing? Fuck off.
In Japan, why do they carry... Oh, I mean, I know Japan has always had the fascination with America, but it's like, come on. Like, in Taiwan, they have it. New Zealand is... Like, all the Anglosphere nations are completely gone. Press F in the chat for the Anglo World Order. It's done for. So,
Drew, were you listening to the conversation before you jumped in, or did you just jump in now and you're rolling with us?
I'm fresh in, so I'm
fresh in.
Up. Yeah.
We were talking a little bit about central banks. We were butting heads with Vedic cyber god Sunny. He thinks there's some kind of Rothschild thing, and Lev was asked if the Rockefellers involved. I think that's all muck. I think that, like, I don't think.
So you're saying there isn't a new world order. There isn't a cosmopolitan group of globalists that seek
I think consensus is not conspiracy.
Central banks.
Consensus is not conspiracy. Consensus is not conspiracy. If a bunch of people
North
have
Korea,
a consensus
Iran,
that the
Cuba,
central banking system is good,
guys, I think we should let Drew talk.
Yeah, let's get Drew's take.
Iran, what do they have in common? What is North Korea, Cuba, all those countries, what do they have in common? Tell me.
We'll circle back.
Okay.
All right, Drew. Let's get.
So here's my take, and I think getting around the conversation of whether there is a specific family behind it. There is an organization that exists that goes across different geographical regions that does control and own debt, right? This is dispersed, and we know there are certain families, like Citigroup is owned by Prince Al Walid out of Saudi Arabia. I mean, there are people who own majority shares in these companies, and there are people who are private stockholders and private board members. But I think what's interesting now is I think we can just look at the issue, which is usury and debt, and specifically there's been a lot of talk over the last century about the Federal Reserve. It pops up a lot in you call conspiracy.
And they kill anyone who tries to.
Sure, and I think it's one of the most protected places. In Washington, D.C., for instance, it's right on the National Mall. You can take a picture of any building, but if you go to the Federal Reserve, you'll be escorted away, even when you're not on the property, by heavily armed guards. I've done it a number of times. So, but the interesting thing I think is happening now is actually what Trump is doing, because whether you like it or not, Trump is taking on the Federal Reserve, and he's actually, in my opinion, changing it. So there was an article on Forbes magazine that came out a month and a half ago that was essentially complaining that Trump was effectively gutting the Federal Reserve and putting it under the Treasury. So those in sort of the conspiracy theory circle should be watching what Trump is doing, if that's their idea. So basically, decoupling the U.S. Note from basically the Federal Reserve, because the U.S. isn't printed, and we know the Federal Reserve is not a governmental agency. It's a private corporation. It has a board of governors that's appointed by the president, but usually that is given to them by the people who are in their cabinet. So this is the first time Trump is slowly replacing the board of governors one by one, and he's expected to replace. There's 12 of them. I think he's expected to replace 7 to 8 of them. And then on top of that, we know that since the 1970s, Nixon coupled the American dollar onto oil, right? The price of oil. So we went off the gold standard, and essentially the Fed back. This is my sister's dog, everybody.
Hey.
I'm babysitting. Essentially we're having this price war right now where oil went into the negative. For the first time, oil went into the negative. So, you could easily imagine that there is actually something happening right now and this happened simultaneously with Trump signing the executive order to essentially put management of the Federal Reserve under the Treasury. At the same time, oil went negative. There's room, of course, for coincidence, but I think sometimes things that big may or may not be, especially when you look at the partnership that Trump has with Prince bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. When they're tight, and actually Trump installed Prince Salman, people were complaining about it night and day. So I think this is just a really interesting stuff happening. I'm not going to say Trump's a good guy, but this is just some of the things that I'm noticing right now.
With the oil, though, the reason why it went negative is because they weren't unloading their inventory, so it became more expensive to store. They ran out of inventory. So because they need to start buying new storage facilities, or just like
but it was a price war. It was a price war between Russia and Saudi Arabia that made it happen. And essentially, both countries, specifically Saudi Arabia, were cooperating with the United States' interest in that. And so the outcome is the surplus that you're seeing, but this was organized, and you can read in the Washington Post or New York Times or any chronicle journal that talks about how this happened and how it came to pass.
By the way, we have a comment from Fuck, who's going to be joining us later on, and he says, less economic policy, more esoteric metaphysics. So that was the original subject that I brought you guys in for today, and I do want to connect it to what we were talking about before, because I'm not sure.
But all money really is a metaphysical entity in the modern world. Don't you agree?
Drew, what do you think? Do you agree?
I'm sorry, say that one more time. I didn't quite hear it.
Oh, that all currency in the modern world pretty much is almost like a metaphysical entity in some respects.
Your volume, Drew, your volume. Your audio. There.
I went backwards. Yeah, I think so. And I think when you look at it, and I've got a lot of friends in the mystical tradition who think one or both ways. If you look at like the ancient Chaldeans, or there's always a question about where the concept of money comes from. But essentially, it's just a symbolic representation of the energy. Generally, it was the energy output of a person. Basically, it's E equals mc squared, right? It's not the speed of light, but it's the speed of man over the course of time, right? So I think, it's sort of a representation of the value of a human being originally, right? Now it's a little bit different because we have different types of equipment. We have, we went to animals, then we went to, now we've got all kinds of computers, machinery. So it's a little bit different, but absolutely. I mean, it's a symbolic representation of energy.
Money's credit that represents human value.
And what do you think is going on right now, Drew, with these protests? As far as I photoshopped in the goddess Kali in the shadow of one of the protesters in front of the fire to symbolize the chaos that's currently going on right now. And what's your take on that?
If you want to stick to the mystical.
Yeah, let's stick to the mystical. Why not?
I think there is certain, theories about like modus, which is essentially centralized points in different types of categories where karma comes through. So you talk about the individual, you talk about the nation state, whatever, any kind of state or group that somebody can be part of is essentially in some theories, I'm speaking more like sort of the theosophical with the angle of Hinduism, where essentially we have energy from lifetimes that sort of gather and congregate and show up. So whenever you have a large movement like now, essentially it's and effectively with all the chaos that's been happening now, this is a wellspring of sort of karmic action. So we understand like karma is sort of like this twofold thing, not what everybody thinks of it as like good karma, bad karma. Karma is action, right? And karma,
every action has a reaction.
Yeah, and it binds us. Essentially, the effect of karma is that it binds us to Shakti, which keeps us reincarnating into different bodies over a period of lifetimes. Right now, we have a major karmic wellspring where people are acting in unison. And so this goes into sort of like the wavelengths of different karmic lumps or whatever that either work out or accumulate. So, there's an opportunity, I think, where the nation or even the world can work out karma, or it can increase its karmic load. And so the question is like, where are people? What do people really want to achieve with what's happening right now? There is, in my mind, I'm not seeing that necessarily people want to achieve lightening their karmic load. Rather, people want to get caught up in basically bind emotionally to specific outcomes. Now, I think, with protesters and people wanting to change the system, that's one thing. But when you look at Reddit, when you look at newscasts, it's focused on the negative, right? It's either, my Facebook feed is very liberal. So it's like, look at what these cops did to these people. I'm hanging out with my parents, and when they turn Fox News, it's look at what these protesters did to these cops in these city streets. So, for the most part, everybody's sort of living out this sort of fantastical, imaginal space where they're increasing their karmic load. Now, there are people actually wanting to change the system, protesting or whatever. And I think maybe hopefully they're trying to work out a better way.
Where do you think, and I want to ask this to everybody as well, where do you think this is all headed to as far as people are afraid of, like we were talking about before with international banking, they're afraid of there being a lack of identity that people can grab onto other than just, their sexual orientation or their preferred pronouns. Like, people are afraid of the things that link them by blood to things that have happened in the past going away and everything just becoming ultra homogenized and just all about consumerism and then all about being like a slave caste being ruled over by the technocratic elites. Do you see something like that happening on the horizon, or no? And if not, why?
I think there's no doubt that there's a definite need to change the system. And I think in this country, people of color, Black people specifically, get the short end of the stick a lot of time for a number of different reasons. And we can argue about what that is, whether it's systemic in the culture or cultural because, whatever, one thing or another. difficult part is, and I think if you're coming from somebody with an incredibly open-minded space, is we look at this and we say, well, there are actually people taking advantage of this, right? Black Lives Matter is a group of individuals, but it's also financed by people who want to see certain types of change happen within the United States or the world at large. So we know, I don't necessarily want to get back into sort of like the economic thing, but we see, and this guy's name comes up all the time. This is an easy pick, but George Soros is one of these guys who is constantly putting money into these social change organizations. And we knew, I can't remember the number right now, I think it was either 50 something or 70 something billion dollars that he had. He ended up donating most of it and keeping only 2 billion to himself and his fund and to his son. And the rest of it went into the Open Society Foundation, which, if you think about it, and you know the Open Society Foundation, that it focuses specifically on social change, right? Now we know that all of a sudden this organization has billions and billions of dollars to play with. Well, where are we seeing it? Where can we best see the effect of billions of dollars coming in? And I think, we can open our eyes and just look at like what's actually been happening since that money transferred. So, it's a difficult thing because I think, these sort of changes, and I'll keep this short because I know I'm talking a lot here, but I was one of the founding members of the Tea Party movement. And we, essentially what it started off with was it was a fundraiser for Ron Paul running for president. It was basically him versus McCain. And we had a record night. We pulled in, it was basically a Tea Party was a night where we raked in money for Ron Paul. I think we $2.2 million, which at that point in time was a record. We kept going with this. It was a lot of libertarians, ex-police, this, and I was in Washington, D.C. doing this. We saw a lot of ex-CIA guys, a lot of ex-DEA guys coming through. And, we actually did a lot, right? So we thought, we were actually making all of this change, right? Okay, great. The election comes and goes. Ron Paul didn't get the nomination. After the election happened, Barack Obama, became president of the United States, and all of a sudden the Tea Party was this massive organization with a lot of funding behind it through the Koch brothers. None of the original founders were a part of this. We had Glenn Beck, Sarah Palin speaking on stage at the National Mall. All of a sudden, this movement that we had created and we had spent months and months working for was co-opted by financial interests that ended up changing the Congress, put Paul Ryan as Speaker of the House, who was not a Tea Party advocate at all. He was not a Tea Party person. He wasn't even a libertarian. So, we can see that, at least in my purview, in my experience, that even with some of the best hopes and ambitions of wanting to make social change, a lot of the times it's taken advantage of by the powers that be to essentially keep the power going, or at least shape it in their own interests.
I wanted to just respond to something Vedic Sunny said in Giant Geo, because he's talking about these suicides, I guess. This was one of my friend's dads in this article of Brokesmith. I went to his funeral. It's a really weird story. I recommend reading it. It's actually a very long article. But for a long time, my friend's brother was convinced there was something really fishy about it. And he was kind of outcast. People kind of didn't want to listen to him, and he was conspiracy guy. Their mom's an artist now, and I don't really know how faux pas it is to talk about, but I'm I guess peripherally aware of the kind of stuff Sonny was talking about. And this is that guy David D. Geo. I did tell you we were gonna know his stuff earlier, and we never brought it up, so I just wanted to.
He died.
Yeah, rest in peace.
He died of fucking cancer a week ago or a few days ago.
Wow. So Sonny, I know you touched on it before, but can you just give a short take of what you see the future being like?
I mean, again, my my beliefs all stem from like a very different sort of, I guess, axiom than pretty much everyone here. I'm pretty firm in my belief of like non-duality and cyclical time. And cyclical time is essentially what I think is going to happen. I think that people mistake the bow of time as like a trajectory. Like if you took, we're blind to history, right? You take a little piece of a circle and you separate it from the whole circle and you look at it and you say, well, it's going up, so time must be linear and progressive. But the bow part of it, it's not perfectly straight. And so that, I don't know. I believe in cyclical time. This is the age of Kali. These things are going to happen. This is just normal. I mean, again, I don't believe in duality. I think that taking all these very firm moral stances on these things and making these moral judgments, it's a waste of time. It's ridiculous. I don't know. I don't know what else to say because
I think Drew's pretty close to that. I don't know, Drew, would you say you'd be pretty close to the same idea of there being these cycles?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, they wouldn't happen if the timing wasn't right either. I mean, it takes a lot of energy to make people coalesce and around certain issues, and it's not, we're not just talking about, I think, the protests, but in general with everything that happened with the virus, the virus coming forward, and even if we can talk about whether it, was man-made or not, the reality is that it whether it was man-made or not happened. There was an energy that brought it forward. It was here for a purpose, in my opinion. And
it's all symptomatic of the times that we're living in, and I think it's very obvious. And I think that there's clearly a trajectory that we're seeing that will. I mean, I don't know. I think that society is definitely going to collapse. I don't know if it's going to be in our lives, but I think that the only thing you should really worry about isn't politics. It's not government stuff. It's not fucking riots happening in the street. It's getting you and your family. If you don't got a family, you should be starting one. Get the fuck somewhere where no one's gonna fucking come and kill you when society collapses. I want to move to like northern Norway, like Finnmark, that sort of area. That would be nice, and I think a lot of people should, maybe look into doing something like that, moving far up north. If your genetics can sustain it. If you can't, sustain living up north for long periods of time, you probably shouldn't move up there. But
I just don't know when exactly that's going to happen. Talking about, again,
we don't know.
The Crown Heights riots and the LA riots, those were a lot bloodier than the ones right now. So on one hand, you are right that there are certain signs of the times, like when everybody's like when all the white people are kneeling down right now, that hasn't happened before. And I wonder what kind of a reaction that's going to create, because it almost seems like that kneeling down, that bending of the knee, even though I'm sure many people are doing that from, wanting to help and having a good heart about it. My concern is that that's also spiritually symbolic of, if people are willing to prostrate themselves like that, what is the limit that they would stop prostrating at here? Like, my fear is that that's
we're a castrated race. That's what we are. We're a castrated people. We're a castrated race, and a lot of white nationalists don't want to admit it, and that's why they're fucking stupid. They think they're better than everyone else. And I think if you really want to do the best for your family, do the best for your people, admit what fucking pathetic people we are as a race, as a collective people. We are fucking pathetic. Look at our country right now. Look at what all of our white people are doing. It's gross. It's pathetic. We're spiritually dead, and I don't think that's going to change. I think if you admit it, it's the first step to getting better. But no one wants to admit it.
Drew, do you agree? Disagree?
I mean, more than anything, I think, people have to understand their own consciousness. And we've been living in an unconscious world for centuries, millennia, or whatever. And I think the ultimate goal of humanity is to wake up at some point in time, whether it be by disaster or by cooperation. I'd hope that would be the case at some point in time. And sometimes it takes effective change happens through complete societies breaking down. This is, you could look at ultimately it comes down to the individual, I think. Being able to let go, being able to dismiss this sort of gravity over fear, which keeps us bound to sort of the reincarnating paths. I think, if we watch enough TV, if we play enough video games, I mean, whatever the case, you can actually feel your anxiety going up, right? And this attaches us to outcomes, it attaches us to expectations of certain things happening. We've got a lot of work to do as individuals, and there are always going to be people who are distracted and who are want to bind themselves to certain beliefs, because it's easier to listen to other people. It's easier to take the route where you become a part of a group, and it's much more difficult to pave your own way. Unfortunately, I think, and if you look at the saints and sages, paving your own way is really the only way to do it. You've got a lot of great books that can help give you, a guide through the forest, essentially, but you still have to go through it.
What would you say about the need people are seeing? Like, from what I understand, Sonny, a lot of people, including yourself and people within your circle, you do have more of an idea of, if only we could collectively do something to bring forth, if not a utopia, a place where at least people like us could associate with people like us. My problem, like I said before, is that with that idea, it means that if me, for example, because I am half Jewish, I'm Jewish from my mom's side, Russian from my dad's side, I'm sorry, like, I love this country. I really like being in New York. I like sushi. I mean, I'd prefer to maybe live some forest place as well. I don't want to go to Israel. I don't want to live in Israel. I like this place, and I want to do whatever I can to make this society that I'm living in a better place and treat people with love and respect. Now, my problem is that if people who are, let's say, on your side are going to paint a broad brush and kick me out regardless because of a certain family that you're talking about happens to, as you say, control the banks, then I have a problem with it for my own, sake.
That's not the point, though, because we're just ethno-nationalists, man. We just want to be left alone with our own people. It's really simple. It's the most simple thing. And honestly, I don't want New York. You guys can have it. I don't care. I don't think anyone can Seriously. I think Anglo-Americans as a people have a future, and I think I don't know where it is, but I think that there are groups that will survive, and they're probably not gonna want people to be in their metaphorical house.
Drew, is there
people can want to be Amish. People should be able, I think what you're saying, I feel like, can easily be misunderstood. Like, I'm not even sure I understand what you're saying, but ultimately,
I'm saying
people should be able to I'm not even asking for a clarification yet, but I think people should be able to free associate and do their own thing. I love the future prospects of seasteading and things like that. I love state rights. I don't think we want a homogenous society. I really resonate with what Elon Musk was saying. I think decentralization is a much more it's not even more robust. It's more extropic in terms of,
what do you think?
Like, how
you said Elon Musk. What about the South African settlement of Orania?
I'm going to need to be educated about a lot of this stuff.
South African settlement of Orania is a community founded by Boers who are decentralized from their government, and they have a Afrikaans speaking only. You have to be a Boer. You have to be a white Boer. You can't even be English if you want to live there. You have to be a Boer who speaks Afrikaans if you want to go there, right? So are you okay with that? Do you think that the South African government should go in and kill them all?
Is that like no. Mining diamonds and stuff?
No, it's a settlement of Boers, of Dutch descendant people living in South Africa who founded the Cape Colony, went on the Voortrek, founded Transvaal, founded the Orange Free State. Then South Africa came. Then they got taken over by the British, right?
I don't really care what other countries do.
But you need to have context. You need to have historical context.
Because it's all kind of a dance, right? It's all kind of
historical context. What do you think about these people?
It's not all these isolated things on their own. As much as people like to think they're all isolated.
It is. It's both isolated and not isolated. It's both. You can have both at the same time without them contradicting.
Ask me what do I think about what they do in other places? I like to think about myself, my family, my friends, my state.
It's the point, though.
I like to think about my country. You know what I
Okay,
mean?
so okay. If there was a group in your country, where do you live? What state do you live in?
I live in New York.
Okay, you're in New York. In upstate New York, there's a community that only wants white Anglo-Saxon descendant people who have descendants from the American Revolution, and it's a little town. And this town doesn't go anywhere else. They just stay in their town. They farm everything themselves. Are you gonna go and kill them?
I think that should be harmless. I think people need situational awareness and to be enlightened. And I think bigotry is disgusting. I think you should be intolerant of genuinely intolerant people, like Karl Popper says, in the sense as in, like, if you have the Nazis from the 1930s saying, you know, like, it's our way or the highway, and we're gonna dominate the world and like create a super race.
I'm not a supremacist. I don't think anyone is a supremacist
look out
like
for that. And nip that.
I don't think anyone believes that.
Bud, right? But I think if you want to be Amish, if you want to have a social club that's all girls, no boys allowed, you want to, you know, just like I said earlier, if you're a baker, and someone said, and you're a Jewish, let's say you're a Jewish baker, and someone said, make my Nazi cake. Like, you should be able to say, no, go fuck yourself. Just like if I really think that when that guy had to make a gay cake, I was really disturbed how the government said, no, you actually have to make this gay cake, right? Just like, I think that businesses should be allowed to do what you want. If I'm wearing a MAGA hat, I said this before, and I'm walking to a New York bar, they're allowed to kick me out. Right? They're allowed to say.
We're not talking about businesses. So, you're talking about like families and group and like,
I thought the
tribe of people.
So did you watch the documentary Wild Wild Country?
No, I don't watch documentaries.
So the Rajneeshis were like a group of, they were like bohemian yuppies.
Second, what kind of thing is that to say? I don't watch documentaries. You just blanket. I don't watch an entire medium of things.
Fuck documentaries.
By the way, we have Andrew.
I read, nigga. I fucking read.
We have Andrew Meyer joining us, by the way.
You can do both, you know. It's not like an either-or situation. You can do both.
I need to watch TV.
By the way, we have Andrew Meyer and Dogbot joining us. Andrew Meyer, for those who don't know, he is the don't tase me bro guy. If you guys recall watching that video with John Kerry.
So, you're one of my heroes, man.
Oh, thank you. What's going on here? I join in. I hear about white people and Nazis. What's happening here? I thought this is a spiritual.
I think all spiritual discussions end up going this way because it is on people's minds, and I think that there is a spiritual dimension to this discussion. So, coming from a Kabbalistic perspective, because you are a Kabbalist, where do you see all of this chaos going right now? Because obviously, this is going to be on people's minds for a long time.
Okay, well, first of all, I don't know if I'm a Kabbalist. That's a very lofty title. I would say I'm a Kabbalah student. I'm no Kabbalist, I don't think. You know, that's for very, very elevated people. But what's going on right now, for people that don't know, it's a time of revealment. Everything that's been concealed for a very long time. You know, like we're finally seeing Epstein, Weinstein, all of the sickness and darkness in Hollywood and media and politics. That's what's coming out right now. That's how I was able to predict Biden would win the primaries, because people don't even understand that there are pedophiles, literal pedophiles, that have been put in positions of power because they're easy to blackmail, they're easy to be controlled. And, things are going to be coming out, more and more revelations. And this is just a time where, people can actually find out what's going on in the world, and they're going to be forced to choose. Do you, if you haven't noticed, the middle ground is disappearing to the point where even Tim Pool is being forced to say things like he'll vote for Trump. Like, the middle ground is disappearing, and it's a spiritual war. Are you going to choose darkness? Are you going to choose light? That's why you got videos like that guy saying, "We support you. We're on your side," while rocks are coming through his window. Like, no, it's red pill time. Do you really want to be on his side? You're going to find out what his side is. And, that's it. Everything that's not connected to light is going to fall. And then you're going to get to choose. Do I want to be in this crazy system of darkness, this satanic system, or am I going to be in the world of light? And it's everybody's choice.
There is an interesting thing I wanted to touch on. Do you know Sabbatai Zevi?
I know of the name. I'm not a fan. Why?
The reason why I mentioned him is I remember reading a post by Drew, who should have been here. I have no idea where Drew is. Drew Tang at home. If any of you guys know him, please contact him right now because I want him on the stream. Anyway, his post was took a Jewish holiday and in a way inverted it, and how a lot of things that were sacred to all kinds of religions have been inverted today, and how the symbolism is very prevalent. So I'm curious if anybody could comment on that.
Definitely. I would say that it goes with the idea of this idea of connecting people around a central idea. I remember a conversation years ago my grandfather and my dad had, where my grandfather said they're trying to break it, break everything. And my dad said, well, why would they want to break this country? And he said, you have to break it in order to fix it. And you see this idea in which all these things that connected people, like kind of the traditional family, whether they're faith or something, that all has to be stripped away in order to provide people with kind of like a new idol to be able to come together around. And I mean, you see this playbook, China, Soviet Union, in which kids are, snitching on their parents about, violating this government law and imposition. This idea that these real legitimate connections are being severed in order to connect people with the state. And we see this on a spiritual level as well, in which the significance of these spiritual holidays, these spiritual figures, are all being removed of their context in order to be this sort of archetype for this new sort of faith or religion for people to get wrapped around. Just for an example, I remember there was a seminary or something in which someone had painted, it was a statue of Christ. They painted it in blackface in order to sort of, we stand racial solidarity, and they decided to leave it up. In which case, Christ in that depiction, he no longer stands for, this no longer the Son of God who came to save the world, free people from their sins. He now becomes a symbol for racial justice. And I think we're seeing that, regardless to whatever faith you have, all of them trying to be broken down to coalesce around this kind of single narrative.
Well, somebody was mentioning, Rioters was mentioning an inverted cross, but that's also the cross of St. Peter. So not really sure if that would count as a symbology. But as far as things like, I know we were talking about the Saturn Black Cube before. I'm curious what Drew's take on it. And Dogbot, I know you're also into the esoteric, and I would love to hear from you as well. What exactly your thoughts are on the whole Saturn Cube thing, as well as the
Dogbot's Twitter handle, because
we gotta put Dogbot's Twitter handle in here. It's Dogbot5, but I'm gonna add it in.
Yep.
So let's start. I know Dogbot. We could start with you. You haven't spoken yet.
The Saturn Dark Cube stuff just really creeps me out, and the fact that everybody decided to go with a black square in solidarity with the death of a very faking gay situation. It's
Wait, why do you block me on Twitter? I just want to ask, why do you have me blocked?
Oh.
I tried to follow you and it said I'm blocked, so I'm just wondering what that's about.
Oh shit, I don't know. Did you?
Okay, can you unblock me?
Yeah, I could probably unblock you. You have no idea. I go on these block fests where I'm blocking trannies and communists and report fags all the time. So I doubt you're one of those.
The Scholus mindset of blocking, the Scholus philosophy of blocking.
My ad's Vedic cyber gods. Just go ahead and unblock me, please. Thank you, so I can follow you.
Alrighty. Yeah, I'll probably get around to doing that at some point this evening.
Oh my God.
Wow. How dare you?
I'm in the middle of a Zoom call right now.
I'm in the middle of a Zoom call too, my dude.
Try and speak right. Sunny is obnoxious, super Veda Buddhist extraordinaire.
Oh, I got some really obnoxious Buddhist friends.
Well, Drew, I don't know, Drew, you are part of the Advaita Vedanta. you are not a Buddhist, right? Like, you subscribe, like we talked about before, to the cycle of history, and the difference, and I just want to bring it back to the cycle thing because I'm curious about Gravitas. You don't believe in the cycle of history. You think that it's all coming to a certain head. Would there be any room for, let's say, being cycles within cycles? Because even if this cycle is over, let's say if we get into New Jerusalem, we're still going to be fighting, as you say, a metaphysical battle against the dark principalities. So there's still a continuation of something that's going on, isn't there?
Well, I mean, I would say there's a cycle on a smaller scale. The idea of, there are some periods in which, sin abounds, and others in which perhaps civilization is more holy. But even then, there's still that kind of spiritual fight. Ultimately, the sort of culmination from the Orthodox Christian perspective is, everything's coming to the head of, the reign of the Antichrist, the second coming of Christ, and that's when sin and everything's abolished, in which, that separation between people. I would say that, kind of the idea of this conflict and whatnot, where Christ talks about, you're going to hear of wars and rumors of wars, nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom. And, in the New Testament times, nation refers to groups of people, kingdoms would be the governments. But all these things must happen before the end comes. So the idea that, this is just a natural state of things, sort of before we have that culmination in which everything gets brought together. So, the idea that salvation isn't from, like these political movements or something. Solzhenitsyn, I posted a quote the other day, something about, if only there were evil people somewhere insidiously doing something, and the only thing we had to do was cut them off from us and destroy them. But, the line dividing good and evil cuts to the hearts of every man. And, who's willing to, destroy a piece of their own heart? And ultimately, I think that's the only real change that we can do. The idea of the kingdom of heaven is within you, that idea that we have to strive for that sort of self-perfection, that self-deification, that strive for holiness, because, otherwise we get distracted, because the only real change you can do is within yourself, and everything else is, I'm repeating myself at this point, but that self-distraction, and, you're going to get the impulses and the proddings from, kind of the demonic powers, because that's ultimately sort of the source behind everything. It's not that, man as this sort of, some can be, this dark evil person. There's no hope. There's no salvation for any of them. Everyone can change. Everyone can come to the light and whatnot. It's these dark influences that are affecting us. The idea that that's the whole point of the Christian baptism. The idea that, when you go into the waters, the old man is being put to death and you come out anew. And the Christian life is that battle against, trying to keep that old man of sin dead, in order to strive towards that holiness, towards that perfection, that deification, theosis. And ultimately, I think that's where the focus should be. Because ultimately, that's the only thing you can change is yourself and, kind of those around you.
I think it's
the kingdom is not of this world, in other words.
Yeah. I think it's very fortunate, by the way, that right between you have Drew Arnold and you have Andrew Meyer. So Andrew's coming from the perspective of the Kabbalah, and Andrew, you've been doing a lot of meditation, and I'm just curious what your guys' take on that, finding that inner peace. Do you see that much of a difference between what you do and what Gravantis is talking about? Let's start with Andrew.
Well, what he was saying actually sounds incredibly Kabbalistic. I was very impressed. He was saying, the only thing you can change is within yourself, and, working on yourself. That's incredibly correct. And I wanted to ask him some things if he understands. You know what a mikveh is?
I do not. I'm not too familiar with that term.
So when people really look into what's going on in Christianity and Judaism, and I would do air quotes right now if I wasn't having the hands on the wheel, but there's so much in Christianity that it's the same in Kabbalah or Judaism, whatever you want to call it. A baptism is basically a mikveh. And, when you're talking, the way you were describing a baptism, saying leaving behind the darkness that you had before and going into the light. I do that on a routine basis, but the amount of gravity that you put into that, because you're saying, well, people for a baptism, I think people do it like once. I do it all the time, but I don't think of it with that level of intensity because I do it so often. To hear you describe it in that way was actually really incredible.
Yeah, I mean, the baptism, from the Orthodox Christian perspective, that's when you enter in, the Christian as the little Christ, that idea that, you're entering into Christ's death and you're resurrecting from the baptismal waters. The idea of that constant fight and battle, that's what the sacrament of confession is, essentially, is that renewal of the baptism, that constant fighting. I fell, I did X, Y, and Z. I fell back into this sin or whatever it may be. I'm still struggling with anger, lust, pride. And it's that constant fight, that constant battle, that constant renewal. So just that kind of connect that point of, the different sacraments that are all kind of pointing to the same direction of that renewal of the self, that deification, that purification of the human soul.
What kind of Christian are you?
I'm an Orthodox Christian.
So that's like the Greek Orthodox Church?
Yeah, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, yeah.
Forgive my ignorance. When did that church split off from the Catholic Church?
That it was people like to put a date at like 1054. I think it's a little less clear than that. I would say for about a 200-year period. That's when sort of the Roman Catholic Church split off over the idea of the supremacy of the Pope. The Orthodox Church, obviously didn't agree with that. That you didn't have to sort of submit to this one central authority and the idea of the Pope in order to sort of attain salvation.
So I'll give you a little bit of knowledge that most people don't know. Even in the old Greek Bibles, very old, 1st century, 2nd century, whatever, the entire thing's written in Greek, but the name of God was still written in Hebrew. Did you know that?
Yeah, it depends on, because I know there's the Septuagint as well. The idea of the Tetragrammaton, I always forget how to pronounce it. Yeah.
Yes, the reason the name of God was still written in Hebrew, even though the entire rest of the Bible was written in Greek, is because those letters, the Yud, K, Vav, K, it's such a powerful name, I don't even say the letters quite properly. Yeah, well, if you pronounce it, it sounds something like that, right? But the point is, those letters, just looking at them with your eyes, they're a connection to God. That's why those letters, they're in a lot of churches around Europe, old churches, you'll find those letters. It's a connection to God. And actually what that represents on different levels, that tetragrammaton, it represents connections to different sphirot, different levels of energy. If you even look into quantum physics, they'll tell you there's 10 dimensions of reality, and that Yud, K, Vav, K, it's corresponding to different dimensions, and it's all energy that we can tap into, basically. And when we're talking about like the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, those 10 dimensions, when you look at it, the upper 3 are called the Father, the middle 6 are the Son, and the lower is the Holy Spirit, and that's our world. And even one of the dimensions specifically is called the Holy Son. And I don't know how many people know this, but like Jesus corresponds to that dimension. If you look at what the purple robe and this and that, it all describes Tiferet, which is one of these 10 sphirot. There's so much Kabbalistic wisdom encoded in Christianity, and I'm not saying that Jesus is just a fairy tale. By the way, Jesus is a real man. Jesus was the Messiah, but a lot of people don't understand that there's more to just that story, that there's a lot. He who hath ears to hear, let him hear. There's a lot that was encoded in Christianity. And I wish that when Jews and Christians study this type of stuff together, this is what created the Enlightenment. The Knights Templar brought the Zohar back from Jerusalem to Spain. And it was the first printing of the Zohar was commissioned by Pope Pius, and it was in Latin. There's so much that's been lost over the centuries because people don't want, they want this wisdom concealed for themselves. They want to put it into secret societies. They want to use it for occult reasons. They want it to be concealed within Masonry or whatever else. But the study of the Zohar, the study of this knowledge, this is what will empower our generation to actually create the golden age.
Is that similar to the Adam Sandler movie when he's a hairdresser, secret agent? Is that the Zohar? The Zohar?
You're one letter off. That movie is you can't mess with the Zohan. It literally has nothing to do with the Zohar, which is the Holy Grail, which is actually the Holy Grail.
Gravantis, what do you think? Where did Gravantis go? I don't know, just as I was about to ask him, he disappeared, but he's going to be back. I actually wanted
to... as soon as we mentioned the Masons.
Yeah, here we go.
Sorry.
Hey, Gravantis.
Freemasons control the world.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, again, I don't know much about that, so I caution speaking anything, sort of in favor or against. And I will say that I don't know, the idea of the name, something that you had brought up, the idea of the name of God, sort of one of the holiest practices in Orthodox Christianity, it's known as the Jesus prayer, that we connect the name of God with the name of Jesus. And in the Hebrew of it, Yahweh is Savior, is salvation, Yeshua, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And that kind of prayerful meditative practice is, the monks on Mount Athos do that for hours a day. So I'll just say, Orthodox Christianity does not, hasn't lost any sort of sense of the sacredness of the name of God. As for anything, other than that, I can't speak one way or the other of it. I'll just say, kind of anything the Pope's sort of done or approved of kind of past, the 10th, 13th century or so. That was kind of outside of Orthodox context, so I can't necessarily comment one way or the other. I would say there's some things that he's done that's kind of been out there, but again.
And I wanted to bring yeah.
That's a nice way. That's a very charitable.
Wait, Andrew, you had a response?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, even in the old Bibles that were all written in Greek, the reason they had the name of God still in Hebrew is because that name itself is powerful. The Hebrew letters aren't just, another language. It's actually a connection that, just looking at these letters, it's very powerful.
What's
it's not
the
like
proof
English.
Of that?
I'm sorry.
Aren't there also 11? I thought there's 11 dimensions because you also have to include there's that extra dimension that measures the others, because that's how they come up with that number, right?
Right.
It's like axes, time, then you have like the protractors, and then you have like the
and with the Sphirot also, there's like an 11th dimension also. It's actually Satan's home, so we don't really discuss it that much. But yes, there's like an 11th one as well, just like in quantum physics where there's a 10 and 11.
Wait, is that supposed to be Doth?
Yeah, we don't say the name, but yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah, there's a couple of names.
What do you think of Norse runes?
What's Doth?
Oh boy, it's the missing part of.
I'm glad you're saying it wrong. He's so happy to say. I say, oh, we don't say that. He's like, oh, let me break the rules. I'm so glad you're saying it wrong, Lev.
Well, it is called break the rules, and there's also a certain female that was present at creation. That was Adam's first wife, who we are also not supposed to talk about. That's a big no. But
Candyman.
Like, what is this like? What's going on?
Amazing. I'm so
he's
glad they don't know how to say it in Hebrew. They want to say the name so badly.
But one thing that I did want to touch on, though, something I sent to Andrew a while back, is the Sefer Raziel HaMalach, and I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, but this is something that I want to tie in. What was that? Okay, this is
Allahu Akbar.
Yes, this is what I wanted to tie into Drew and Sunny, actually, because both of you guys are Vedic scholars in your own way. You're very, very much into meditation, just as I am. But this Sefer Raziel has all of these various magical sigils, and I've always been fascinated about this idea having to do with, like, it says over here that this book was given to Adam after the fall by the angel Raziel, and it also says that it explains how the creative life energy starts with a thought from the spiritual realms, transcending into speech and action in this physical world. The eternal divine creative life energy of this earth is love. The book explains the spiritual laws of birth, death, reincarnation of the soul, and many spiritual laws of change. So that's interesting for me, that reincarnation is also a part of the Kabbalah, from what I understand, or at least a lot of Kabbalists who I've listened to, they've alluded to that. But I wanted to bring this to Drew Arnold. Drew, you meditate, you do all kinds of things related to these esoteric spiritual practices. Do you see a connection between what I'm talking about here with these sigils and this idea of energy starting with a thought? being related to the things you do?
Yeah, first I want to say I'm not a scholar in any way, shape, or form.
You are to me.
I just get enthusiastic about certain ideas and principles. So I just jump in 2 feet and see what happens. And I think I'm a student of a lot of different things. Primarily right now, I study or practice Sufism. I like some of this Vedic. I read different Vedic books. I practice Freemasonry. I'm a part of a Freemasonic organization in New York. It's based on the Theosophical Society. It was an offshoot of the Theosophical Society. It has men and women in it. So it was founded by the Theosophical Society in the 1800s. It was split off. We're not recognized by the rest of the Freemasonic system. But I will say that, with Freemasonry, because it was brought up, that essentially, it's a tool, it's a system that can be used to understand things much like religion, and can be abused much like religion. So, Freemasonry at large is not necessarily a conduit for negativity or darkness, but it allows people, or it shows people certain mysteries that then people do whatever they want with. And I think for the most part, most of the organization and the men's lodges, they're just boys clubs. They don't really get into the mystical systems. They're there essentially to continue to push their, to get people to pay dues and to exist. And they're essentially dying off for the most part, much like a lot of mystical organizations right now, strangely. Which can be both good and bad. But I wanted to sort of circle back, so to speak, to a point you were talking about earlier with the cycles. And I think what's interesting to me, and I'll just bring this up, in Buddhism, there's something called, in Hinduism, there's something called samsara, right? And in Buddhism, it's the wheel, right? So samsara essentially is just sort of like this process of continual reincarnation. And in Buddhism, specifically Tibetan Buddhism, it's shown as a wheel. And what's interesting about this is the cyclical nature of all things exists within this. The Tibetans do a really good job of sort of breaking it down. In Hinduism, general Hinduism, it's just the wheel. And in Tibetan Buddhism, they go into the architecture of it. But as it's generally depicted, it has the center. All of life and all consciousness essentially forms around this and is pushed through this wheel. But in every depiction, Buddha is standing outside the wheel, pointing away from it. So I think, just getting back into cycles and all of this, part of this and part of the big grip that humanity has to wrap its mind around essentially is to release itself from this dual nature. Like humanity itself, there's only one real force that comes into this. It's just consciousness itself. God consciousness sort of push through, and we have what people think of as lightness and darkness. We're not really in a dual world here. We're literally consciousness that has something veiled over it. And so I think the purpose of mankind, whether you're into enlightenment in the mystical sense or enlightenment in the scientific sense, is we have an obligation to ourselves to continue to lift and free ourselves from like the physical blocks that help us discover our higher selves, whether that is our obligation to society at large and trying to make a better system, or to understand ourselves and our higher consciousness.
Now, we were making a point before. I remember Sunny was talking about how something like war is a necessary part of life, and we're never really going to be able to exist without it. And I could also see, like, Fuck just wrote, enlightenment has darkened our world. Again, going to the idea of fighting against the modern condition, where people would see something like warfare, something where you could prove your honor as being, let's say, holier than, being a social justice warrior. So I'm curious about your perspective on that, whether there is something that we're missing here. Do we necessarily, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Sonny, but from what I understand, you think that it would be better to go back to a situation where we would be able to prove our worth on the battlefield. And Drew, I'm curious what you think about that in relation to the Bhagavad Gita, or maybe just like going beyond all that warfare altogether to something else. Yes, Sonny.
Can I interrupt really quickly? I just want to say I don't really think that people should read the Gita. Again, I'm not a Hindu. I don't subscribe to Hindu beliefs. The only Hindu text, what you would call a Hindu text, that I really advocate people reading is only the Rig Vedas, because it's the one that was written right when the Aryans settled in where they settled. And I'm getting really tired, but that's my point, is that I don't like the Gita, none of that shit. You feel me?
Drew, what say you?
I love the Bhagavad Gita. And I think foremost, if anybody's not familiar with the Bhagavad Gita, essentially we have a king, Arjuna, who is essentially preparing for an oncoming war. He's on the battlefield. His uncle and his brother, I think it is, are essentially an invading army, and they're essentially going to attack him. And Arjuna has made the decision to not fight his brother in order to spare the lives of his entire kingdom, because he's thinking about how many lives would be lost and how much of the kingdom would be lost in the process. Then I'm sorry, who comes down to his not Brahma,
Krishna.
Krishna, thank you.
Krishna,
comes down to visit him and has this conversation, and essentially shows him many different paths in front of him. The synopsis is in my impression is that, war can be inevitable at some point in time, but I think what was communicated to Arjuna was that instead of, he understood that going into this with hate or any kind of in order to engage in some way, shape, or form, could be incredibly harmful, right? Could get him into a state of continual incarnation, whatever. Arjuna shows him Arjuna has shown us a separate path, which essentially is to engage physically without engaging spiritually in this battle, without engaging himself into getting himself to harm himself or to increase his karmic load. So essentially what the beauty of that is because all of the previous Vedas were essentially peaceful works. This one showed that you may have a duty at some point in time to make brutal decisions that may effectively physically harm other people, but that you can do it without if it's your obligation to do it without increasing your karmic load or to disrupt the karmic cycle of the people around you.
I noticed Info Warlock made an expression. I'm not sure whether that was because of Drew or because of something going on in the background. But Info Warlock, do you want to respond?
Oh, hey, Lev. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah. We hear you loud and clear.
Awesome. Hey, thanks for inviting me. And this is just technical stuff. I don't really have any input on the Bhagavad Gita. But I was making notes on all of the kind of earlier topics and everything. And I don't know. There's a lot of things I could say. Do you have any specific thing that you want me to address that's not the Bhagavad Gita?
Well, the specific thing that I'd want to address is what Sonny was talking about earlier, as far as we need to have war. And what I'm curious is, and I'm going to ask this to Drew, to Andrew as well, whether we can ascend to a higher state where we could leave something like war behind us, where there could be other things that we would occupy ourselves with. Or is war a necessary part, and just having a lot of bloodshed and carnage, is that all a necessary part of our life in order to fulfill us somehow, and otherwise we would just degenerate?
Yeah, okay. So, I think that it's really, I love conversations about politics and about religion and spirituality. But I think that it's interesting that a lot of people they don't contextualize all of these things. And the actual circumstances, of the modern world are kind of unprecedented This is a high technological world. And so I think it has its own kind of challenges, right? And sorry, I'm just looking at my notes.
Everybody subscribe right now. Whoever's listening, please subscribe. We want to get the subscribe count up so we can have more of these amazing shows. And I really want to thank everybody for watching.
All right, nice filibuster there. Okay, here's the thing. I'd say that war, it's changed in its nature, right? It's become technological. And so it's completely different. And I agree with Vedic cyber god, like in the way things had been in the past. But they have developed during historical circumstances to a high technological period. And frankly, I think ever since World War I think that was an example of, that was really the robot apocalypse in a lot of ways, because human beings were the losers of that. And they really, they became, their inadequacies towards the machines became apparent. And we were really destroyed by the machines at that point. And ever since, it kind of explains the world that we live in now, the new technological world, where we're all kind of held captive by technology. And so I think that changes all of our social situations entirely. And talking about pre-modern ideas, they're good. Strong and intelligent people should be thinking about these values. I'm a big fan of BAP and whatnot. But we do have to be creative and realize that we're dealing with an unprecedented circumstances here, right?
I agree. We definitely are. I just don't know what direction we're gonna go on because, and we're going to have Tim Napier joining us later on, along with Kimberly Coulter, who is Ann Coulter's niece, for anybody who doesn't know. And Tim likes to talk about. Oh, sure. 1 second, though. He likes to talk about, that cycle of history where strong men make good times, yada, yada, yada. So, anyway, that is something that's been of concern to me. I just don't want us to degrade. But, Dogbot, go for it.
But this isn't really a cycle of history, though. This is the high technological period. It's totally unprecedented. So, and, people talk about political...
Prove it.
Well, okay, sorry, God. I think that is probably true about antediluvian civilization, but since we don't really have a lot of we don't have a lot of evidence, so it's all conjecture to talk about that.
We got the Graham Hancock stuff with the precession of the equinoxes and all the structures that were built to
right.
Yes.
So the age of Aquarius, you could say that's absolutely empirically true, right? It's the technological age. And it's a totally new age. So that is an empirical statement of fact, is it not?
Sure. I mean, this is something that I'm curious about Gravantus's view on, because Gravantus, you are also aware of all these antediluvian civilizations that were talked about. But what would you say the difference is, as far as, I had a private conversation with Graham Hancock, and he told me that he thinks that this cycle has been going on for a very, very long time, where maybe it wasn't just Atlantis. Maybe there were other things before that. And if we take that view, as well as the view of other planets where there's intelligent life just like us, and I bet that they don't look like Star Trek aliens, they actually look like human beings. And I just imagine they would also go through these similar cycles. That's why it's hard for me to imagine that just with this one part of Revelation coming to pass, then that would be the end, and then it's going to be New Jerusalem. And that's my own personal reason why it's hard for me to come on board with the Orthobros, at least at this time.
Well, I mean, I would at least say that kind of the antediluvian period, it's very much shrouded in kind of, it's very mystical in the language. You see the talk of the Nephilim, this kind of idea of spirits and women creating these sort of creatures together, whatever that may be. I'm of the opinion that sort of the Cain and Abel, that type of archetype, agricultural versus the civilizational force. And, you see this technological rise from the descendants of Cain before kind of the flood wipes everything out. I would say that the difference between then and now, aside from the covenant of Noah, the idea that we're not going to have another flood, is the idea of sort of the timeless, immortal God who exists outside of time, sort of entering into time at the incarnation of Christ. I think that is, from an Orthodox Christian perspective, is where the difference comes about. So there's not going to be another. So the next flood that's going to come, in a sense, will be one of fire, and that'll be at the second coming. That at that point, there's no denying sort of what's happening. That's sort of not necessarily the end of time, but sort of the entrance into eternity in that sense.
Interesting. So that would still make room for there being, let's say, other planets and other times that we've gone through for who knows how long, where cycles would have repeated and repeated and repeated.
Perhaps. I would just say the idea of kind of like an alien species or something. The idea of man being the pinnacle of creation, being made in the image of God, I don't think it leaves room for the idea of an alien species.
Well, again, I'm not talking about like Star Trek aliens. I'm talking about also being made in the image of God. As far as this form, I don't think it's a random form. Like the distance from the chin to the nose, from the nose to the eyebrow ridge, from the eyebrow ridge to the top of the head, it's equal parts, and no other animal possesses this. And we are, like, I know you're not a fan of Aleister Crowley, but Aleister Crowley talked about how we're all stars, and we do have a 5-pointed star shape. So there is sacred geometry going on in the form of a human being. And that's why I'm always fascinated by what kind of other abilities do we have. And this is what I wanted to touch on with Drew Arnold. But before that, Drew, you mentioned that you were a Mason. You are a Mason. And there was a Masonic pin I remember seeing with, I think it was called Tubal Cain. And it had a weird thing that looked kind of like...
That's a joke. That's a dick joke.
Well, this is what I'm curious about. Like, is it a forgery? Is it a fake thing? Like this, Jules, I don't know if you could pull it up. The Tubal Cain pin.
Tubal Cain.
Yeah.
It's just dude things. It's just bros being bros.
Golf rumors.
Hell yeah, brother. Bros being bros. What's better than that?
It's a Masonic thing?
Yeah. Yeah, Tubalcain.
So we were talking about how the descendants of Cain would have been the technocrats. Is that what you were talking about, Gruvantis?
Yeah, that's it's kind of like the extra biblical tradition, the idea of the rise of it, and definitely the influence of sort of the fallen angels onto the rise of technology as well.
And it's interesting because it does come together with the idea that people have of there being this technocracy that wants to enslave us, and how they look at that as being these there we go. And see, it kind of looks like the Facebook symbol, doesn't it? Like it has those thumbs up.
What the Facebook symbol's designed after.
And we also have the Gmail logo looking like that Masonic apron.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly if it's just all a joke, just all something to get your jollies on. Like Drew, looking at all of this symbology that's being used, as well as the, like the Eye of Horus symbology and all that, what is your take on why people are using all this stuff? Is it just to have fun, or even poke fun at the people who want to draw certain conclusions from it?
Are those the only options?
I don't know. I'm curious.
I think it's a humiliation ritual.
I mean, it's a little bit of both. And I mean, if you want to talk about
boys being boys,
if you want to talk about the difference between having humility and being humiliated, I mean, maybe some people can't see the difference between it, but there's with Tubal Cain, and I'll say this because I can't get into like, the specific secrets of the Freemasonic doctrine, but I can say that Freemasonry itself is focused on the presentation of certain symbols as a way to allegoricalize or create an allegory out of universal truths, essentially. So, we can look at certain symbols and say, we can talk about like the generation of man and what that is. We have male and female power. How do we symbolize that? How do we symbolize cycles? How do we symbolize, and how does that fit into a certain tradition? How do we talk about the consciousness of man descending from God consciousness into our human form? And all of that is embedded inside the mystical tradition of Freemasonry. Tubal Cain fits into that. And I'll go as far as to say, yes, it's also a joke as well, because inside the Freemasonic doctrine, there is a great deal of humility is involved, specifically through the initiations, in order to, and I think historically it was done, in order to show or to demonstrate that human consciousness escapes death through a certain, both through shown through the ritual, but through man's own working. So what Freemasonry doesn't do, it doesn't do the work for you, much like many mystical traditions pretend. But we look specifically toward what we can do. In some senses, look, I'm not going to speak for all Freemasonic traditions, because there are a lot of them that are completely one-dimensional. There are people who go up the ranks because it gets them a little bit more accreditation in a society, a brotherhood, or whatever they're looking for. I'm part of the mystical tradition. Like I said, it was founded as an offshoot of theosophy. So it is.
Which lodge?
It's lodge number 352.
I meant is it Scottish Rites or Grand Orient?
It used to be called Co-Masonry. It's now called International Freemasonry for Men and Women. So we initiate men and women. It's predominantly run by females. So
wow, a female-run fraternal society.
It's much different than most of it. But at the same time, I think
that's progressive.
I think our lodge holds, at least as I've talked to other Freemasonic organizations, we have a much more rigid ritual than almost any male lodge that I've heard of. So, we go deep into the symbolism. Everybody who's a part of the lodge is a part of another mystical system, and we all bring our knowledge together inside that system. So, but again, it's probably different than a lot of other people practice.
Well, I'm glad that Andrew Meyer is back on camera, because I wanted to tie this into the Kabbalistic Tree of Life, where I see a very huge similarity between the architecture of those two pillars and the pillars in the Kabbalistic Tree of Life. So the structure of Freemasonry, Kabbalistic Tree of Life, I just think we got to stop pretending that these are two completely different things, that they are talking about, the same process. So I'm curious what your take is.
I haven't studied very deeply into Masonry, but it's the fact that what they're doing is basically crib notes from the Zohar, through a game of telephone. So they've got some stuff there. It's all from the Zohar. There's no doubt about it. When did the Masons appear? When did the Zohar appear? You can connect the dots. But I'll tell you,
Masons have existed since Egypt.
Oh, okay. And how long has the Zohar been around? Do you know?
Nope.
Okay, so why do you interject? Why do you interject? You don't even know what you're talking about.
Well, tell me. That's what the point of the stream is.
I'm happy to tell you. Don't interject things that you don't know what you're talking about. You say, "Well, the Masons have been around since so long." What is that relevant? You don't even know if it's relevant.
They're from Atlantis, dude. They're from Atlantis.
You know what you're talking about. It's incredible. The young people of this generation are amazing to me. They think they have
boomer,
and they don't. It's just amazing. Have some
I don't give a fuck about your Jew religion, dude. I don't give a fuck about your fucking Yid Jew religion.
You know what? You know what?
I said I don't give a fuck
about to get under your skin. Hold on, that's so inappropriate. We had a confrontation earlier. That's really not cool.
That's hilarious.
It's not cool.
Yeah. Anyway, when you're talking about wars earlier, no, it's not necessary to have physical wars, but this time period, it's called the War of Gog Magog. It's a war of consciousness, and we're all in it whether we like it or not. And even if you read like the frontline thinkers in Western society that think about war and such, this is fourth generation warfare, where there's no delineation between soldiers on the battlefield and civilians. Everybody is on the battlefield of propaganda. And that's a biblical thing. It's been talked about for a long time. The War of Gog Magog. It's a war of consciousness. So can you get to peace without war? Apparently not. We're going through this war right now. This could be the last war. All we have to do is raise our consciousness, though. We don't need to have physical wars. We don't need to go to war physically with China. What we need to do is win the war of consciousness, and that happens from everybody individually doing
Hold on. Do you really think that everyone on the entire planet is capable of this spiritual?
No, absolutely not.
They're just gonna So
you don't need every single person on the planet. You don't need every single person on the planet. You need a critical mass. That's what you need.
Right. How much is a critical mass?
There's no specific number.
Too.
There's no specific number of what it's going to take. Maybe it's 1% of humanity, maybe it's 10%, but nobody's expecting that everybody in the world is suddenly going to be saying kumbaya. But at least people that are like in this room, for example, these are some pretty smart cookies in this room. Even the guy I was telling to pipe down earlier. These are some pretty smart.
Boomer.
Oh, shit. If I may interject for a moment.
Go for it.
Oh, did I cut you off, Andrew? Oh, did I cut you off?
I don't know. Go ahead, man.
No, I think a criticism, having spent a lot of time in my younger years and a lot of what would you call it, liberty movement, conspiracy, whatnot, and a large part of the New Age. I think the problem is that it's always going to come down to the question of consciousness raising and whether it will materialize into a praxis or an actuality. To cross over from potentiality into actuality is always going to be a huge problem, because we're dealing with what I would think quite literally satanic forces in the world. And to counteract that, I think is going to take more than simply people being aware on a higher level. This is my problem, I think, with all sort of decentralized politics. Even a nomadology of the spiritual would have to require some amount of organizing and practice and practical steps, and that probably will include even physical war. This is unavoidable. This is a constant throughout human history. And I think that's a huge downside to a lot of people. I think even Sunny said earlier about people who have a higher IQ. Because what is intelligence? I think IQ is sort of a reductionist metric, but let's, for the sake of argument, a higher IQ, a higher understanding of things. The problem is you're sort of not taking into account the vast majority of people. Like, for example, I was just scrolling through Twitter. You look at my Twitter, I commented upon this fucking video of a Marvel movie where it's like the protesters and the corporations coming to help the protesters. It's like, this is how people think. They literally think Baby Brain, Harry Potter, Marvel Universe. This is how most people understand their watch along. So I think that's a huge problem, is that, and some people, I understand what Andrew was saying about critical mass. That is important, obviously. It is important to have a vanguard, but I just don't see for the foreseeable future. Lev, you asked the question about what our vision of the future is. I tend to disagree in the sort of doomsday optimism collapse scenario as much as I would wish to have that. I think it's not going to happen. I think that things will progressively get shittier to the point where Western countries will become sort of enslaved to the conditions that are present in the third or the global fifth world. But I don't think that, I think a huge massive collapse is too optimistic. I think the greater black pill would be as if this demonic system found a way to continue on for at least the foreseeable future. I think that's the greater black pill, not a collapse. A collapse, you can, all bets are off anyways. But yeah.
I want to hear more about the war of consciousness against China. I want to know more about that game. I learned when Google beat the Go players, that board game with the black and white pieces, and it's all about territory and surrounding territory, and so like the pieces are constantly going back and forth. It's I learned that it's also a board game that can teach you a lot about life in a lot of circumstances. And Mark Twain said that, what is it? Did he say God invented war to teach Americans about geography? But it's just, I don't know what's going on with China. I know that I think people are Like 90% of our medicine is made over there. Like a lot of the stuff we need to survive is made over there. Like we don't want a supply chain problem.
You want a hot take, Jules?
Yeah, I want that first.
You want a hot take? Like in politics right now, if you can see, most of what's going on is that the Western powers, which, and Dugan has a lot to say about this. This is a sea power. America derives a lot of its power from controlling waterways and preventing piracy so that trade can continue internationally. And they have right now they are hegemonic, but what they're trying to do is stop China, Russia, and Iran from forming a power block in Eurasia, because that would be, not only do they not really need the waterways in that case, but they would also just be a total threat to the current world order, which is the sea power, the Atlanticists, as it were, the lineage of Atlantis, one could say. And
I see Lev rolling his eyes right now.
Scary.
Okay, we had a comment. We had a comment from Bulat Usmanov. We in Russia and other post-communist places will generously accept Western white refugees when your countries are brought to ruin that you allowed, but you will have no political rights for generations. So I would say other post-communist places, go to those far before you go to Russia. The other post-communist places don't want Russia going to them. So,
Lev, can't you realize that Russia's based in Redcon? I can't believe this.
What's the block? Can you explain what's that block again? What was it? It was Iran, China.
Oh yeah, China, Russia, and Iran. And well, I mean, basically all the Stan areas, basically a Eurasian alliance. But if you look at the
why do some people think?
Well, if you look at the Western propaganda, it's really all based on those three countries and demonizing them, isolating them, and setting up pretense for invasion or other sort of sabotage. Because what they don't want is for those countries to form a strategic alliance, which they are, right? I mean, this is kind of happening. But yeah, and if you look at the propaganda out there through that lens, I think it makes a lot more sense to you.
Info Warlock, I would highly recommend later on when you're interested, I could introduce you to some people who live in Russia, and they would be able to let you know better than I would what exactly life is like there.
Yeah, sure. I'm sure it's nice. I mean, I'm sure, generally most places are pretty nice.
I tend to disagree a lot with that.
I've done some traveling. The closest I've been to Russia was Poland. And
not the same.
And Bosnia. Well, kind of.
Those places, and as well as like Latvia and Lithuania, they are scared to fucking death of Russia. They don't want Russia coming into their territory at all, and for good reason.
Right. I know politically they're very different, but in a lot of ways, like just being just a beautiful natural beauty place.
I think he's just saying as Slavic peoples that are descended from the same Slavic group of people, they're pretty similar, I think is his point.
I would say the big difference is that a lot of the Russian people, for generation upon generation, were serfs and were living in the state of like animals, and I think that also played a very big role in what ended up happening afterwards. Obviously, not with everybody, but with a lot of people. I think the darkness that we saw during Stalin's time had a lot to do with those times when they were living in both physical and mental squalor. But I wanted to move on from this, and I see Drew is writing something. I'm kind of curious about what that is. But also, Drew, we were talking before about all these various systems, and we were talking about the Masonic system, the Kabbalistic system, but we also have the system of Kundalini and the 7 chakras, which, again, I'm not going to pretend like I am not seeing a very direct pattern here when it comes to the 7 chakras aligning with the Kabbalistic tree of life. It just seems to fit into each other very much so. And it is like the system of the body and of maybe the universe, which talks about like a progression from lower states to higher states. That's pretty much the simplest way that I could phrase that. And I was wondering if you could also talk about what we could do. I mean, there's Wim Hof method, there's yoga, there's all kinds of things, what we could do to rise our levels of consciousness up right now. And I'd be curious about Graventus's take of the potential dangers with doing that as well.
I mean, I'll start with the dangers first, because I think, every time you break a system, there's feedback that happens immediately. So, there's, in the mystical traditions, there's always notes about, when you go into it, no matter which part of the world you're in, when you go into these deep states of, let's say you start seeing a little bit of light or whatever it is, you go into a deep mystical, you go into a trance, you go into some mystical state. When you come back, the world has changed for you, and essentially you've broken, you've sent ripples out into the world, and those ripples come back again, and they affect you in your life. So, effectively, the people who experience the most pain, the most, or have to come in contact with their suffering, are those that are further down, if you want to call it the spiritual path or the mystical path, right? It's like hell is reserved for the people who have been doing a lot of work, right? Everybody else can take it a little bit more easy, can put it off a little bit more. And even in the Buddhist sense, when you talk about people who have Buddhic, who've gone to the Buddhic realm, they actually, some of them go through 1 billion years of hell, of essentially burning. And it's actually can be looked at very similar to the Christian aspect of hell.
You're talking about the Bardo?
Yeah, and essentially, the whole point is that they're burning off collective karma. So they're doing work, and I think this talks, we can get it into also the earlier conversation when we talk about like the vanguard, essentially, right? The people who are there, who are helping everybody else up the ladder, who have whatever done their work in the mystical sense. At that higher realm, they go through hell. They have to suffer for other people. And I think, we also see this, and this is pre-Christian, but we saw Jesus, essentially the story of Jesus was no different, right? He went in hell for 3 days, but in hell, I'm sure they don't have a calendar. So I think, that's sort of like the downside of doing any of this work, because, in my path, it's like every time I have a major breakthrough with my own consciousness, it's like my world shifts incredibly. Things don't work the same way they used to. And that can mean a whole lot of different things. It's like, the job, the relationship, or whatever has to change. Something goes south. But how do you get there, right? What kind of work can you do? And I think there's a lot of different paths out there. And I think that's the beauty of being a human being, is that ultimately the biggest tool that we have is our own bodies. And in order to see our own consciousness, look, Wim Hof is incredibly powerful. Wim Hof studied under Vedic masters in India. He doesn't say this publicly, but I know a lot of the Wim Hof instructors that he taught. And essentially, he's borrowing from this very dynamic experience that comes from the Vedic tradition. He studied in India for a number of years. You can do deep breathing, you can do meditation, you can pray, you can fast. I mean, you can run, you can turn off the television, you can be in nature, you can farm for yourself, you can make love to your woman or your man. There's just so many different ways to sort of open up to sort of the universal Shakti or universal truth.
Like tantric? You mean tantric?
Yeah, I mean, Tantra is kind of misunderstood, because I think Tantra doesn't necessarily describe sex. There's a certain type of sexual practice that is tantric, but I think even like in a loving relationship, connecting with another human being and seeing the universality of everything is incredibly powerful, right? It's like, we live in a divided world, and
it can be a powerful delusion as well, though.
Yeah, well, everything in this world is a series of divisions that we normally experiencing it. When we unify ourselves to another human being, when we have empathy, when we sort of have a process that does away with the difference between you and another, whether it's another human being or the tree or whatever, that gets you closer to a state of divinity and closer to sort of like the universal truth.
Graventus, I'd love your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll bounce off. Drew had mentioned sort of Christ in hell, the idea that, you know, that's where the soul was while his body was in the tomb during the 3 days. I would say the difference, of course, is that, you know, Christ suffered on the cross as man, but in hell he was God. You know, the hymnography speaks of, you know, hell took a man and found God, that he very much arrived as that idea of the victor, that breaking down the gates, opening up heaven and paradise to man. So it wasn't as if he suffered in hell at all. I know some prosperity gospel preachers kind of delve into that territory, but, you know, that's not the traditional understanding of it. But it was in that point in which man could finally sort of achieve salvation, sort of be in that heavenly realm. And kind of to touch on that, the idea of, you know, suffering salvation in that sense, the Orthodox perspective of hell, because what exists now, hell, that separation from God, it won't exist in the future. When the book of Revelation, it talks about death and hell will be thrown into the lake of fire. The idea of Jehana in the Orthodox perspective is that sort of the second coming of Christ, everyone's going to experience God. Everyone's going to be in the presence of God. And it's just whether or not man can withstand that. The idea that the same fire that men see as sort of torturous hell is going to be the same light that the saints shine with.
Do you think there's with like the Bardo parallels between that?
I'm not familiar. I'm not too familiar with that, so I can't speak of the specifics. I don't want to, you know, misquote or anything. I'm just unfamiliar with that tradition.
Okay.
But so yeah, that's what I would say, and kind of just like touching on the idea of spiritual experiences in general. That's why kind of the Orthodox sort of emphasize this very sober-minded spirituality, not to get caught up in these mystical experiences or visions, because you're not exactly sure where it's coming from in the end. You know, there are people who have genuine experiences with God, and there are people who have it with, you know, sort of malicious spirits. And it's very easy to get fooled and to get mixed up, especially when you sort of get puffed up in pride and saying, you know, God's sending this message to me, I'm seeing an angel now. So, you know, it's always one of those things where I stress kind of caution and sober-mindedness, not to get caught up in this religious ecstasy, because you can very much be led astray.
Jules, you wanted to hear about China, right?
I don't know where Jules is right now, but before Jules gets here, Drew, do you have any other thing to add about being led astray from these spiritual experiences?
Yeah, I think I can't remember the terminology, but in Chinese Buddhism and Japanese Shintoism, they both have a similar name for it. It's escaping me right now, but essentially it's like fireworks, right? Sometimes when we go into these mystical systems or whatever, we see a lot. We get euphoria, we get a high, we get to see fireworks, we can have all kinds of phantom visions, all of this stuff. You know, I think a lot of these mystical traditions talk about, you know, how are you led astray, right? And I think in the Christian sense, it's a little bit more about escaping a path of divinity. In Buddhist sense, it's more like you're distracted. I think I'll talk. Since the Bardo was mentioned, you know, I'm not an expert matter on the subject, and it's really only my point of view. But the Bardo is sort of like a superliminal state between when you die and before you're reborn, and, you know, is there a state in between that? And there's different thoughts about what that is with response to sort of like Buddhism or Hinduism. You know, as far as I understand, it can be seen two ways. One of which, and I'll like put it like the VR headset anachronism, which is we're in the VR experience. We take the headset off. We have a moment in time before we put one back on again. And then there's another system which essentially says, look, we exist as conscious beings in multiple bodies simultaneously. We are a conscious being. This is sort of like the Hindu Buddhist sense. We are conscious in multiple bodies, but there's an aspect of our consciousness that we are all experiencing here that is particular to whatever 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional space. But in reality, we're also having a 5D or whatever experience.
5G.
Yeah, 5G experience. All the
Just
way
kidding.
all the way up to like the Buddhic experience, right? And that like God is at the helm of all of this, having a multitude of experiences simultaneously. So in that, there is no breaking away from the experience between death and rebirth. It's just continuously flowing through everything. And I think those are the sort of the two predominant theories that surround like the Buddhist philosophy around it.
That's interesting, and I wanted to get Tim Napier's take on this as well. Tim, thank you so much for joining us again. We were talking about a lot of different things related to spirituality, about the various spiritual systems, and
Right.
I am kind of torn in that I could see a lot of these meditative practices resulting in being too attached to prelest, like it was talked about before, just this overly pleasurable sense. And at the same time, though, I see things being referenced in all kinds of different literature about something like a third eye, where there is an actual third eye that could be seen in meditation. Take it however you will. It takes the form of a star. It even takes the form of a cross, which also makes me wonder how much that also has to do with Christianity. But that cross, it's something that it's right in the center, kind of like a target sign. And out of it come all the perspective lines in this grid-like tunnel that people enter into during meditative states. So I think that there is a system here, and it may be something that is worth looking into, but also being careful about, because if we were to get to a higher state of consciousness, whatever that may entail, I think it could be a great weapon for us. But Tim, I don't know how much perspective you have on meditation and all these various occult forces that are around us, but I'm interested in what your take is on them.
Well, it's always a pleasure to be back, and I've thought a lot about this, actually. I used to attend a shaman in Princeton. She was going for her doctorate in some sort of she was going into Gestalt theory heavily. She read a lot of Jung, and she was trying to mix kinds of like spiritualism with Freudian psychology, which was it was interesting. And for me, it was like, I knew that I'd just gotten out. I knew that I needed to like calm down. And it seemed like the easiest transition into therapy for me, because I'm not really into like talking about my feelings. It felt very unnatural. So it was a nice transition. And as she and I started talking theology, I brought up that I'd read the Bhagavad Gita before I'd been released. And then I read 3 or 4 different versions of the Bible, and just tried to get some sort of a good taste of religion with purpose, because all I'd ever understood of religion was that I wanted to avoid it, because I'd seen it as the propaganda version, which is it's just a big organized system meant to control you until you had to think, and I had no concept of God. I just knew I didn't want to be a part of that. I was very anti-establishment. So for me, that meant reject the idea. I used to cringe at the word God. People would say pray, and I'd be like, oh, I remember that sensation. I was just young, and I hadn't really thought about it, but
God is a cringy word.
Yeah. So, it depends on your perspective. Like to comment on what Drew was saying, I like the 2 different theories for, at least as Hinduism go, for reincarnation. There's one in which God is a mind that is almost split and schizophrenic, like a spider web with fractals of broken glass in it. And we are all God, individual pieces of God's individual perspective, like subjective and objective at once. And there are moments where we can completely see everyone and realize we're all part of it, but we're never actually going to be together again. We can only be together in like segments of spiritualism, which is like group thinking hallucination, which is fascinating when people start using earth medicines, and they can all have a very similar emotional reaction to a drug, which is feasibly impossible for everyone to start getting sad and thinking of a memory that some of them didn't even organically have. Like it's a trackable phenomena. So I think that group prayer, I mean, the sections of your brain that illuminate on scan when you actively engage in prayer, that's a trackable phenomena. That's not just a feeling. That's not just a vibe.
If you want to talk about religion in the modern world, I would say that the same techniques that used to utilize through mantra, like altering your mind state, I think that people are weaponizing those now through different mediums to get people to feel certain ways about political elements or cultural shifts. And it's alarming to me because I can see that climate change is a bit of a cult, Extinction Rebellion is a bit of a religious cult. And if you go against it, you see the same fervor I see in religious zealots. I spend a lot of time talking to people that are avid, aggressive Catholic to the point that they almost sound like jihadists. And it's frightening to see them. There's lots of different names for all sorts. I don't keep up with the lingo. It's impossible at this point. But like a lot of these people, it seems like they just want to believe in something, and they're being programmed to think that if you don't buy their thing whole cloth, wholesale, there has to be immediate conflict. And that goes so against, in my opinion, the idea of spirituality, which you would achieve in talking to almost any practitioner of the faith. I've had conversations with imams that were actually meaningful. It's like you can talk to anyone depending on where their mindset is. If they're really trying to figure out, like, I don't know the answers, but someone does. So if we all pull together and figure out what we can figure out, we might be better off. That mentality doesn't exist when you get into frigid, like, well, this is how it has to be. This is the way God told me it has to be. That's a mentality that I get very nervous around.
Graventus, do you see the potential harm in that mentality, even for the Orthodox faith, if people just get too much into following whatever Archimandrit or Metropolit has to say?
Yeah, Christ, in his final sermon to the apostles, kind of at the Last Supper, he says, love one another as I loved you. That's how men will know that you're my disciples. And that's kind of like the true mark. There's a group, kind of the idea that people get stuck on these particulars. They get stuck on these minute rules and traditions that don't speak to the actual heart of the faith. There's a group in the 1920s. There was kind of a debate about changing of the church calendar, and a group had split off as a result in disagreement for it. A lot were brought back in, but some had remained kind of zealots against the church as a whole. And you see some monasteries where these monks who had split off become these like super rigorous zealots throwing Molotov cocktails. And at that point, you're missing the entirety of, what's the faith at that point? If these minute sort of things that people get caught up in, whether it's the church calendar or, they talk about certain styles of dress or X, Y, or Z, whatever you want to call it, and where they get so obsessed with these sort of the letter of the law, they miss the spirit of it. And I mean, it's definitely a trap that the more traditionalist mindset can fall into, this sort of hyper rigorism, and you kind of lose the warmth of the faith as a whole.
Like Bulat just wrote, Staroviry, the old believers. That is also a sect that's still present in Russia. In fact, there was one that was living all through World War II, had no idea it was going on, and then they were discovered, and that must have been a very interesting couple of years for them. But also, I wanted to bring it to Drew Arnold. When it comes to what we're seeing today with the conversations we've had today with Sunny, where there does seem to be a need people have of wanting to separate by race and not wanting there to be any negative influences from people of another race coming in. I see things as there could be a possible solution of having an open door policy for whoever wants to contribute into your society. And I know that right now, having this conversation, we're kind of diverting away from the spiritual a bit, but I would be amiss if I didn't touch on this and get your take on seeing if there could be some kind of a balance that could be worked out. And in a way, it's also kind of a spiritual question too in that sense.
I mean, I think you'd have to, unless you want to be incredibly disappointed with your life. I mean, the truth is that we live in a space where through our pure existence, we are dealing with a much more diverse group of people than our ancestors were. It's just the state of the world. And sooner or later, every tribe that's on the planet is going to assimilate into some sort of aspect of a global society, unless the entire thing shuts down, right? But I can't imagine the entire system shutting down unless it was some major cataclysm that happened via an asteroid or something like that. I don't think the ice caps melting will do it. People will move inland. You know, I think, you know, as much as the ice caps can melt and sea levels rise, really not going to affect things at large. But I think at least in terms of like whether or not humanity exists or not, things will be more difficult in some areas, but you know, people will move around. And I think we just have to be prepared, you know, for people who want to live insular lives. I don't think I think nation states can make the decision on whether or not they want to assimilate. But as individuals, we can't expect that we're going to have privacy or be shielded from the dynamics of the rest of the world. It's just not going to happen. You know, I think and I think a lot of people, you know, let's say like Ruby Ridge, for instance, they were labeled white nationalists. Well, you know, they were white and they were nationalists, but you know, the issue is at the larger crux of this is the system going to allow people to exist on their own or off the grid? And people have had a lot of trouble over the course of several decades attempting to do that. You know, the system has a way of reeling people back in by way of force or by way of seduction. And I think, you know, a lot of people I know who even live off the land or like to the hardcore sort of like in the woods libertarians,
like Ted Kaczynski.
Yeah, well, they still have cell phones. Well, I mean, Ted has figured out a way to stay insulated from the rest of the world just fine now. I mean, it ended up working. And he doesn't have to deal with but a limited number of people.
Yeah. No forest though. He's not surrounded by Mother Nature.
No, only bars. But you know what? I have to look in. I have to look into where he is now. But he's.
But his whole message is specifically skepticism towards this technological global world system that you're talking about.
Exactly, and I think what I'm saying is like, look what happens to people who push back very hard against. I mean, look. Ted was mailing package bombs to people, so that was probably not the best way to do it.
If you just said it worked out for him, though.
Well, yeah, I mean, it worked out. I was being sarcastic in a way, like what he wanted was to be away from other people, and I'm just saying he got what he wanted. Maybe not in the form that he wanted.
He's a NEET.
Huh?
He's a NEET now. He just sits around and he messages people all the time, like we do on Twitter.
He wasn't advocating skepticism. It was downright nihilism and cynicism. He was saying.
Well, he was totally against it, but I think that if you look at his message, it's skeptical of the direction of the system.
No, I think it just, if you read what he wrote and you just watch what he did, there's no, it's not advocating skepticism. He was saying, like, this is a non-negotiable, like we cannot have a society with technology where the technology depends on multiple people operating it, because it will be co-opted by big forces like super governments or whatever, and it'll lead to a totalitarian state.
Don't you think like the bit of skepticism is healthy? Like when we're trying to do something,
I think
like
skepticism is essential. I just don't think that was Ted Kaczynski. I just don't.
Okay, I'm not a Kaczynskiite, so I'm not really going to defend him. But just a measure of skepticism when we're talking about building something totally new. Like, how do we engage with something totally new? There's so many factors that we're totally unaware of. Like, it's very risky. You know, but a lot of people have this really starry-eyed idea of it. Like, it's just going to be great. And there's, you know, it's kind of weird, but.
Look, I think I brought this up last time, but it flows into what we were just talking about. Any technology you don't fully understand is magic to the primate that's trying to use it. If you don't understand how it works, but you know you push a button and the microwave lights up, you know you push a button and the food inside gets hot, you know you push a button and it makes a ding noise, all you know is that it does something. You don't know how it works. So if mantra, you know that a certain mantra can get you guys juiced up before you row your boats. You know, another one gets you really tired, gets you really into groupthink or meditation. You know, another one makes you fucking hallucinate when you eat certain berries. You can use that magic, that tech that you don't understand yet.
So, but here's a question, though. I totally agree with you. You have a great point. But I think also if most people don't understand the technological world around them, so for people to actually live on a daily basis in a world that they literally don't understand, isn't that alienating on like a deeply core like level? Don't they feel like trapped in a system and they don't, you know, isn't that confusing and alienating?
Yes, to some degree. Like if we're talking about Kaczynski, he was right. what was if you'd have told Ted, you know what, no matter what you do within the next 25 years, here's what Earth looks like. And you explain that everybody walks around with a tracker in their pocket that's emitting radiation. Everything you say is monitored if it's near the object. Everyone knows what you order, what you eat, what you throw away. They know who you hang out with, because if someone else has a tracker that comes near yours, the government knows your two trackers were in the same room. If you explained that, oh, and it's a phone and it's a status symbol and everybody has one. Kids will be willing to steal them from stores. They need them. Yeah, and like you need it to talk to anybody, to see your mom. You need this thing. People won't know how to get to their favorite shops without using the GPS on it. If you told him that, he would have probably sent more bombs, dude. He would have sent more
Good point.
Well, maybe it was the LSD that he took, which allowed him to have some precognitive abilities, which was the original reason why he ended up going the way he did. I mean,
he also had like an IQ of 170, which is a whopper.
Yeah. I've known a lot of really smart people. They usually there's always some quirk. There's always a quirk. There's always something a little off.
The quirky sending out mail bombs. What a quirky guy.
Dude, that's a quirk. Yeah, that's something. It's weird. Everything else about him is like you can almost understand it.
I totally agree. Awesome. You know, I would actually suggest people check out this author who's an amazing author. His name is Neil Postman, because he was a general critic and a skeptic of technological society, but he wrote these great books. They're not very big, they're very accessible, and they have good humor and good wit. And it was just kind of, you read this and you're like, why is everybody rushing headlong into this totally unknown abyss of technological society? It's absolutely crazy, and most people are so optimistic that they're entirely on board with this. They're like lemmings that are stoked to jump off a cliff, and I'm not sure there's actually a bungee cord attached. I mean, how do we know?
Well, I mean, it's the exact same reason that the opioid crisis is what it is right now, because a lot of these devices work on shortwave dopamine loops, and we're getting into it, and I click something from sending a certain message and people give me positive response. So I send another message that's similar to that first one. I get more of a positive response. I say something out of line, I get less response. Trains me how to think. And not only does it train me how to think and what to say, it trains me what to react to. Because if I react negatively to something everyone else likes, I'll get shit from the group. And now I'm oxytocin connected. So I'm like, oh God, did I do the wrong thing? How do I fit in? It's
I like that answer. That's very practical and ground level. I like that answer. Well, what about Drew? What about Drew here? You seemed pretty optimistic about like, oh, everyone's just going to join this utopia and we're all just going to learn to love it. Like, are you sure about that? I mean, how can you be sure about that?
That's definitely not what I said.
And that is a common sentiment.
No, what I was saying was that if you're going to resist the standing society, good luck. There are more and more distractions out there for you. So, I think that.
So you're skeptical too, then?
Well, what I'm saying is that from my own experience, as someone who's done a whole lot of, I've gone through different communes. I've lived off the land for a little bit. I like to take hikes through the woods that last a week or two and see if I can forage while I'm out there. I know all the plants that are around. I have moments where I have these amazing dreams, especially now, about essentially you call it, but off-grid living or whatever you want to say. The reality is uncoupling yourself from this persistent reality that we have that's technology driven is incredibly difficult. And I've been indoctrinated into the cult of technology. I'm using it right now. I'm on here. It's like, do I have the power to let go and live a life free of all of these distractions from real reality? Or it's like.
But what kind of reality are you living in, let's say, when you meditate? Because in a way, that also unlocks an internal internet, which we haven't really figured out how to make the most use of yet. But that could be a way out of possible technological slavery.
Well, it does for a while, but then you come back. So, I mean, sure, you can have all sorts of different types of experiences, meditating or under some sort of psychotropic substance or whatever, religious experience, but then you come back and you're here. So what do you do at that point in time, right?
Well, there are people out there like Nikola Tesla who was like, you have the expression incel. Well, he was an involuntary guru.
But he was a mystic.
He didn't practice it though. Like he was born into it. Like he didn't attend any seminars.
Right. No. Yeah. Like he was actually receiving visions. He was chosen by by divinity. But Lev, actually that makes sense, because if you think about it, there's a long tradition of like mystics being hermits and monks and foregoing any kind of sexual pleasure. So maybe incels are actually the hermit monks of our age,
Well, as long as they're not spilling their seed, then maybe that could result in, with the right yogic practices, a Kundalini awakening, and then they're also going to be able to do something. But Drew, to the point that you were bringing up, like you're in those states and then you come back, I don't really think that's the end of it. I mean, you're probably way more advanced than I am when it comes to the amount of practice you've had. My gut instinct tells me that there are going to be people out there like Tesla, like Jet Propulsion Labs, what's his name? I'm blanking out right now. Jack Parsons.
Parsons.
Yes, exactly. There are going to be people out there who make a hell of a lot of difference in the world, who all talk about the same shit as far as abilities that they were able to have either from birth or cultivate, which means that they do have a direct effect on the way things end up going in this life we live in right now. So do you see a potential there for that changing a lot in the future?
That's a good question. Yeah, I don't know how to answer that. I mean, you'd hope that people could, I think here's the sort of the bigger picture of it. And this is, I heard this from a Sufi teacher, and it made perfect sense. Nowadays, we live in a space where we have access to a more that helps guide us to a higher state, but at the same time, we have more distractions available to us. So, I think in a way we can go further, but we have to be stronger in order to do that, which means in some ways there are fewer people who are able to do it, but those people go further, possibly, right? I don't really have the answer to that. I think it's just, one of those, like, we'll see what happens situations.
We will indeed. And
that makes a lot of sense. Like, I don't know, if I could just jump onto that real quick. I think that it's important to think, there's something that I think is important that I think about often. Like, I suffer from PTSD real bad. And something I have to remember is my perception of time was inaccurate. For the longest time, I saw time entirely as a linear function. It went in a chronological order, only in one direction. No, I simultaneously live in about 9 different memories all the time. And I'm actively there. I'm actively 8 years old most of the time. Some small part of me is. And some small event can trigger a lapse in my reality. And my reaction will be terror, which goes immediately to adrenaline, which goes immediately to an inappropriate response, because I'm not in 2020 all the time. Like, and when you trip enough, or when you meditate enough, when you get yourself deep, you're adjusting your frequency like a river trying to carve its way through a landscape. And with a log in the way, the river will go around the log. If you take the log away again, the river is still going to go around where the log used to be. It's not just going to fix itself. So, like, you're doing elaborate change, dense, difficult change, like working with clay and a carving knife. And you can't just fix that shit, because even if you smooth it over on the top, there's going to be surfaces underneath. You pop it in the kiln, those spaces with air are going to pop. You're going to have a huge problem. Like, it's got to be slow and steady with how you treat your mind. And a lot of people think I can buy this demethyluri $5 a hit shit and achieve enlightenment, and I'll cure myself. And what you're going to end up really doing is fucking yourself over, because you're going to put all your faith in an altered state instead of putting faith in either yourself or ideally in a deity beyond yourself. And you're going to be disappointed, because we're all just people. It's like the end of the day, whenever there's some horrible terrorist event, when they pull the mask off, it's just going to be a guy. If until the day they pull the mask off and it's the devil himself, you're going to be disappointed. It's just some douchebag. Like,
well, I guess the idea is that some douchebag could be influenced and powered by these unseen forces. At least that's what the archaic Greeks used to believe, that we are all controlled by the will of the gods. And I guess one idea that's present, I guess, in Gnosticism is that you would get rid of a lot of these various powers and principalities that are influencing you in order to just have a clear tunnel to the one that's the most important. And I know that that's different. I guess so. I don't know. Like, Gnosticism, it's got a lot of different ranks of all these various deities that take control of your mind. But there is something to that, I think, as far as getting rid of, I wouldn't say getting rid of the ego, but trying to integrate the ego into this world in such a way that it's not going to hurt other people, that it's not going to take advantage of other people, or when it has to fight, it's going to fight for the sake of, you know, the family and the community instead of just for gain.
Well, it's like having a telescope, and the more you can retain in your active consciousness before your equanimity breaks and you don't go insane, is like you grow a little bit more. You're able to take in a little bit more. So you're looking at first, it's such a narrow, like a paper towel tube, till eventually you can take in, okay, it's not just me and this person. There's this dynamic and another dynamic and another dynamic, and you keep zooming out like a fractal until you can take in a whole bunch of reality, until eventually you reach your tipping point and you flee from it. You shrink again. You get tribal. And you go, if you have a sharp mind, you're going to scratch. Right? A sharp mind will scratch the walls. And if there's something under there. A sharp mind will just keep scratching.
I have a question. I have a question for Gravantis. What would you interpret the phrase "resist not evil" that Jesus said means?
I mean, for that, it's a personal evil, like the idea that if someone's going to slight you personally, you know, insult your pride or something, you know, that's the whole idea of the Christian concept of forgiveness. You know, he's not saying, you know, if someone puts a knife in your hand and says, go kill this person, to do it. It's the idea of something personally against you, you know, not to sort of bear that grudge, these idea of blood feuds or something where, you know, decades and decades, families are like perpetually in a feud against one another, you know, just because of a slight that happened, you know, that doesn't even involve the people that are alive anymore. So that's the idea, that we're not supposed to get caught up in these sort of earthly feuds and get puffed up with pride. That idea that, you know, our true enemy isn't our neighbor. It isn't the person who, you know, insults you, calls you dumb or whatever. You know, it's the sin within us. And so to kind of segue to the conversations about the mental idea, the idea of stillness, you know, I've talked about it before, the idea of hesychasm, that idea of stillness, that, you know, just sort of quieting our minds, and in that contemplative prayer sort of really helps to kind of escape those passions that war against us. You know, I've mentioned this before, the idea of Satan as the prince of the power of the air, the idea that this constant noise that we're always being bombarded with, the idea we need to kind of withdraw inwardly in order to kind of escape that.
But when we withdraw inwardly, if let's say we have some kind of a, I don't know, like, let's say there's somebody who's fantasizing about strangling their neighbor, and that's something that happens to be in their mind 24/7. They're not going to go to war with their neighbor, yet they still have that thought, you know, their neighbor double-crossed them or something. That's going to be difficult to get rid of, I imagine. But
oh yeah,
yeah,
no, it's definitely, you know, we're always going to have these thoughts. You know, some of them come up within ourselves, some of them may be influenced by, you know, malevolent force or something. These sort of ideas that just randomly pop in our head, or that may bother us, they may be a deep-seated issue we have, but they also might be something that is meant to tempt us, to provoke us. The idea that we're not our thoughts and we need not to sort of cling to them. We've all had that, where we're driving and someone cuts us off and you're like, well, I hope he crashes later. You know, sort of those things in which we need to catch ourselves in the moment and sort of, you know, not bear that grudge, that hatred that sort of kind of gets stirred up. To kind of segue to the conversation we were talking about, that idea of sort of escaping society or something. The whole point of the idea of the Christian life is, you know, the Christian homeland is sort of heaven. The idea that we're sort of these sojourners in life, that, you know, no one land is a place we call our home, but we're still supposed to care for our neighbor. The parable of the Good Samaritan, you know, who is our neighbor? It's the person in need. And I think that's something that, you know, we need to care for ourselves and our neighbor. You see these stories in New York City or something where someone gets stabbed and left on the street, and, you know, someone's videotaping and everyone's just walking by. You know, that's one of the things that we need to address, regardless of whether it's a homogenous society or it's a diverse society. You know, we just don't see one another as, you know, the neighbor, someone who is also that human. It's very easy, in order to not just demonize an enemy, but to eschew someone who, you know, well, I'm busy. You know, they're just, you know, this is just what happens. They're going to die. I think that both those ideas are something that we need to fight against.
I definitely agree. Drew, do you have I noticed your hand was reaching for the unmute button.
Oh, no, I wasn't. I was actually just going to look something up that he was talking about. But
Hey, can I ask Gravantis something?
Yeah.
Go for it.
So, and I'm not that familiar with orthodoxy, so I maybe don't know, but so there's an afterworld, an afterlife that could potentially be eternal paradise. So this is like, so in light of that belief, then this world is kind of just a prelude, and also just like maybe 100-year interview to see if you can get into that paradise. Do you know what I mean? It's from that viewpoint, like, how important is this world? I mean, you do have your church and sustain your church and help your community, but it seems to defeat the kind of idea of an earthly paradise, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, the idea that the kingdom's not of this world, we're never going to be able to create an earthly paradise. That's the thing. That doesn't mean we don't help people. But, you mentioned kind of the idea of this world as an interview. That's, I forget the exact saint who said it, but said, this life was made for repentance. The idea that, this is sort of when the time when you're able to sort of purge yourselves of these passions, of these sins, in order to strive towards holiness. The idea that, this life is very much important. Kind of segue the idea, how some people have criticized the idea of Christianity, the idea that you only get one shot, or else, then you get to paradise or you get to, damnation. From the Orthodox standpoint is you don't have that one shot. Your life is continually, you're going to fall, you're going to make a mistake, you're going to get mad. But, the very next minute you can change things. That cycle that, currently we're in that process of changing in order to reach that elevated state. So, when we do die, where is our heart aligned? The idea of this life as a journey, salvation as a journey, that, in that moment when we die, is our attention, is our heart, is it directed towards love, is it directed towards God, or are we currently in the middle of some sort of hatred or something? Because that's going to be ultimately the state in which we're judged. We're judged where we are in that moment.
What would
beautiful.
Be that is beautiful. What would be the situation when it comes to, let's say, if you're a quadriplegic deaf mute, like you were born with just like some very bad condition where you would not really be able to engage in the kind of life that someone who during their entire life would be able to make all of these mistakes and repent and so on and so forth?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's one of the things. The person is, they're not judged based off what someone else did. They're judged, on their self, on their whatever opportunities they may have had, whatever their life circumstances were. It's not like, it's not a standardized test or anything. It's, very much based on the individual. It's not going to be at Judgment Day, we look to our neighbor and we're like, well, I did better than him. Well, that doesn't matter. You're not judged based on what someone else did or didn't do, or could or could not do.
It reminds me kind of that South Park episode, Do the Handicapped Go to Hell? When they want to bring Timmy to confession and find out, if he can't say anything except for Timma, how could he actually confess? Thus, I guess that would be more of a Catholic situation, right? Wait, do you have confession as well or no?
We have confession.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if it's different from Catholic confession as far as like you have the booths and all that same deal.
Yeah, for the Orthodox confession, it's kind of you stand right next to the priest. You're both facing the icon, so it's not as if your identity is concealed or anything. The idea that you want to have a regular confessor, so someone who knows you, so sort of something you're habitually falling for or something you're extremely struggling with, he knows you on a personal level, and that idea that he's going to sort of give his advice or whatever based off of your own personal needs.
Very interesting. I wanted to get to the final topic of discussion tonight, which would be the actual title of this live stream, Revelation, Apocalypse, call whatever you want. I wanted to get everybody's thought on this, whether like I know that Sunny and Drew, you talked about we are in these cycles, but the whole point of a cycle is that eventually it has to come to a certain crescendo. And I don't know if we are coming to a certain crescendo right now, whether that would have a transition to something else, but it's always really fascinated me, especially right now with all of these riots being incited, and not just the riots themselves, because like I said in the very beginning, we had other riots before that were very horrible, and we had so much bloodshed in the 20th century, and forget about it, like compared to what's happening now. But we are also experiencing much more loneliness right now, I think, just much more compartmentalization of people, and we've never experienced that to such an extent before, and it does seem like something is up. We are headed to something. So I would love for Tim to get your take on it first, and then we'll just go around, and that's going to conclude the stream.
I unfortunately have to jump off. I've got a phone conversation I've got to be a part of in a short while, but thank you all.
Thank you, Drew. I really appreciate you coming in here.
Thanks for coming, Drew.
Thanks, Drew.
It's good to chat.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay. End of the line kind of conversation. All right. What I think is happening is I think the United States has been the target for a very long time by quite a few alternative ideologies, some of which were pre-United States in their creation and have been very furious with the way we turned out. Some of them are aligned with members and access sects of our government, black channel funding, and there's a lot of ideas that have been tossed around for what the future of this country specifically was supposed to look like. And a lot of people have argued over the decades as different powers changed hands. And it's going to be, what's that quote? This is how the world ends, not with a bang, but with a whimper. I think that the world's ending right now.